tonight, somewhere on this turning earth, the sky outside your window has gone dark. Streetlights glow, screens flicker, and you're lying in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the modern world. Far below that calm surface of ordinary noise, past the last glimmer of moonlight on the waves, another world is waking. Beneath the ships and buoys and coastal cities, the ocean at night becomes a slow, drifting galaxy of life. Tiny plankton rise from the depths in the largest daily migration on the planet, lanternfish pulse with cold blue light, and whales trace silent paths through black water. And threading through that darkness, unseen, something enormous moves with the steady confidence of an ancient memory. Imagine a shadow longer than a city bus, then longer than 2, then 3. A shark up to 60 feet from nose to tail, heavier than a dozen elephants, with jaws large enough to swallow a small car in a single bite. Its teeth are the size of a human hand, thick and triangular, made to shear through whalebone as easily as you might bite through bread. This is Megalodon, the lost apex predator of the seas, ruler of warm oceans for millions of years. Megalodon's bite would have unleashed more energy than almost any vertebrate in Earth's history, an impact concentrated into a crescent of bone and enamel. For a long time, its story has been framed as absence, as an extinction that cleared the way for modern whales and great white sharks. But tonight, we're going to ask a different question. What if Megalodon never vanished? What if, right now, as you lie there and take a deep breath, it's still hunted beneath the waves? Close your eyes for a moment and let the modern world fade away. Cargo ships slide slowly across the horizon, their hulls humming with engines and electricity, unaware that far below them, in the blue-black water of a mid-ocean trench, a single giant shark is rising from the depths. It moves through modern shipping lanes and past deep-sea cables, slipping between oil rigs and research submarines, a relic of another chapter in Earth's history sharing space with GPS signals and satellite maps. In this documentary, we're going to follow that counterfactual world. This is the story of an ocean where Megalodon survived, where its presence reshapes food webs, alters whale migrations, and changes how humans fish, travel, and explore after dark. We're going to blend what science tells us about real sharks, deep-sea behavior, and nighttime hunting with careful imagination, staying close to realistic ecology, letting the pace remain slow, cinematic, and soothing rather than frightening. This is a thought experiment, not a hidden warning. Megalodon disappeared from the real oceans millions of years ago, but by picturing it gliding through the present, we can see the patterns of predators and prey, the fragile architecture of marine life, and our own place in that vast system from a new angle. The ocean at night is already another world. Adding a living Megalodon to that darkness would change how energy moves through it, how fear and safety are distributed, how every hunt and every migration unfolds. Before we go any further, settle in. If this slow, calm way of wandering through deep oceans and ancient predators helps you loosen your grip on the day, you are welcome to follow or subscribe wherever you are listening, on Spotify, on YouTube, or in your podcast app of choice. Only if this kind of careful storytelling soothes you. There is no urgency. The decision can be as unhurried. Tell us that it ranged across the world, favouring warm, temperate seas where newborn whales learn to swim and ancient coastlines curved in unfamiliar shapes. The rock holds those teeth in quiet rows, each one a fossilised blade, each one a precise, silent data point. Scientists do not have a complete skeleton. Cartilage decays, bone survives. So most of what is known comes from those massive teeth and a few calcified vertebrae, preserved like beads on a stone necklace. From the height and width of the teeth, from the spacing of the vertebrae, researchers reconstruct jaws large enough to swallow a modern great white whole, then work backwards to estimate the length of the body that carried them. The numbers vary. Some calculations suggest around 50 feet, others push closer to 60 feet or more, 3 times the length of a great white, with a bite force that may have reached 180,000 newtons. The debate continues because scaling from teeth to total size is not an exact science. Different models, different living analogues, different assumptions about body shape all change the answer. Yet all those lines of evidence converge on the same feeling. This was an animal that redefined what it meant to be a predator. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away. Imagine warm Miocene oceans, richer in heat, with no polar ice caps, where the horizon is broken by the backs of early whales, by the domed shells of giant sea turtles, by the brief, arcing silhouettes of primitive dolphins. Beneath them, just beyond the reach of full daylight, a darker form moves, a shadow longer than a bus, cruising the continental shelves, rising through green water toward the silhouettes above. Within a geological instant, the calm surface becomes a place of sudden impact and dispersing blood, then closes again, indifferent. In the rock record, that rain does not last forever. As the Pliocene approaches, oceans begin to cool, currents shift, reshaping migration routes and nursery grounds. Many of the warm water whales that fed Megalodon decline or move, and new competitors arrive. Great white sharks refining their ambush strategies in cooler seas, orcas learning to hunt in coordinated pods, bringing a different kind of social intelligence to the hunt. The energy of the oceans is redistributed, and the giant that once sat so securely at the top finds fewer safe harbours. The teeth grow younger toward the surface, then stop. No reliable Megalodon fossils in the last few million years. No carcasses washed ashore in historical memory. No verified photographs. No sonar traces that can withstand scrutiny. For an animal that probably spent much of its time in productive coastal waters, hiding from humans, from satellites, from shipping lanes, would be almost impossible. So the scientific consensus is firm. Megalodon is gone, its extinction another chapter in Earth's long, uneven story of loss and renewal. And yet, we're going to ask a different question. If such a giant did not vanish, what would it take for it to slip past those constraints? What if, instead of ruling the sunlit shallows, a remnant population retreated into darker, deeper realms, changing its behaviour, its hunting patterns, its preferred habitats, until it became something quieter, rarer, almost invisible? In the world we're going to imagine, Megalodon did not die out. It learned to disappear, not from existence, but into the abyssal folds of the sea, in a single continuous sea draped over a rocky planet. On average, that water is nearly 2.5 miles deep, a cold blue weight pressing on the crust. In places it falls away into trenches more than twice that, narrow wounds in the seafloor deeper than the height of Everest, where the pressure would crush a steel hull as easily as a soda can. When we say we know our world, we are often speaking of a thin skin, the atmosphere we breathe, the first few 100 feet of ocean, where sunlight still carries the energy for photosynthesis, where our ships, cables, and coastal fisheries go about their quiet work. Below that bright ceiling, our knowledge thins. Only a portion of the global seafloor has been mapped in high resolution, and direct human visits to abyssal plains and trenches are rare, brief descents, more comparable to expeditions to the moon than to a casual swim. For most of history, the deep ocean has been an almost theoretical place, inferred from instruments and echoes, its real inhabitants only occasionally sending a body or a sound up into our realm. Even in the last few decades, the ocean has reminded us how much can hide in its folds. The giant squid, an animal longer than a bus, was spoken of in sailors' stories for years before cameras finally caught one alive in its own world. Beaked whales, superb deep divers that can vanish for hours into the black, are still being named and described today, their lives reconstructed from rare strandings and distant clicks. Strange noises, such as the famous bloop, once hinted at unknown leviathans before careful work traced them back to shifting ice, showing how easily our instruments can be surprised. Depth, darkness, and crushing pressure become a kind of armour, a shield against human attention. Most of our fishing nets scrape only the upper layers. Most shipping lanes ride the surface. Tourism skims the top. Vast volumes of water below remain almost untouched, turning canyons, seamounts, and mid-ocean ridges into natural corridors where large bodies could pass unseen, their presence marked only by subtle changes in currents or the sudden silence of smaller prey. If a lineage of Megalodon had refused extinction, if it had endured within a geological instant by adapting rather than vanishing, it would have had to leave the sunlit coasts it once ruled. Warming and cooling cycles, shifting currents, and the rise of new competitors would have pushed it away from crowded continental shelves down into twilight and midnight zones where human eyes and human impact are scarce. This is the story of a giant learning to live in the shadows, but there is an objection that will not go away. A predator 15 to 60 feet long is not a ghost. It needs energy. It needs food, in great regular quantities, or its heart will stop and its lineage will truly end. We're going to ask where such an animal could hunt in the modern ocean, without announcing itself through mass strandings of whales, shattered hulls, or obvious scars on the bodies we haul aboard. The answer, if there is one, lies in motion rather than in stillness, in the daily breathing of the sea itself. Every night, when the sun slips behind Earth's curve, entire layers of life begin to rise and fall, a hidden migration that would change everything for a hunter waiting in the dark. In the next part of this story, we're going to follow that movement and see where a shadow the size of a bus might pass quietly, beneath the waves you hear outside your window tonight. Out in that hidden migration, another pattern quietly emerges. Many of the hunters that rule our world do their work in the hours when human eyes are closed, when coastal cities are only faint halos on the horizon, sunset, and several shark species surge into shallows under starlight, when fish and seals are outlined as pale shapes against the faint glow of the surface. If Megalodon had endured the long, cooling years after its near extinction, we're going to ask whether it would have followed that path into darkness. Climate shifts would have pushed warm, temperate water into narrower bands. New competitors, agile orcas hunting in coordinated pods, would have filled daylight hours with fast, noisy attacks. Later, our own ships and nets and engines would have poured energy and metal into the upper ocean, turning coastal shallows into crowded corridors of sound. Within a geological instant, the safest time for a giant would no longer be noon. So this is the story of a lineage gradually exiled from the sun. Generation by generation, the largest sharks retreat into deeper, dimmer water by day, rising toward the surface only when light is low and human presence thins. Hunting at night would make each kill quieter in the record we keep. Fewer witnesses, fewer phones held up against the sky, more carcasses broken apart by smaller sharks and scavengers before dawn paints blood as colour instead of shadow. To thrive there, selection would favour senses tuned to the almost dark. Slightly larger pupils and a higher density of light-sensitive cells would turn starlight into usable images. Electroreception, already present in modern sharks, would become exquisitely refined, mapping the faint electric fields of muscles and hearts tens of feet away. The low-frequency thump of a distant whale's tail, or the slow heartbeat of a sleeping giant near the surface, would travel through bone and cartilage as clearly as thunder through rock. Nothing here is magical. Many sharks already see well in low light, already read electric whispers, already feel vibrations that our own bodies ignore. A nocturnal Megalodon would simply be an extreme, scaled-up continuation of traits that exist in the oceans of our world tonight. Somewhere far offshore, beneath a moonlit surface, we're going to follow one more shape. A mass the length of a bus glides upward through the dark, drawn to the steady pulse of a drifting whale, and the sea above it is calm as if nothing at all is moving below. Far above that rising shape, the ocean is quietly divided into layers, stacked one upon another, a kind of invisible architecture that most eyes never see. Near the surface, in the first few dozen feet, sunlight still has power, feeding drifting plants and bright fish. This is the sunlit realm, the epipelagic zone, where colour and motion crowd every patch of water that the light can touch. Below it, the glow begins to fail. In the mesopelagic twilight zone, day is reduced to a dim blue suggestion, too weak for most plants, strong enough only to outline passing bodies as silhouettes. Deeper still, past about 3,000 feet, the bathypelagic midnight zone begins, and for hundreds of vertical feet the world is almost completely dark, lit only by the cold sparks of bioluminescent organs and the occasional passing reflection from a distant submarine or falling rock. If a lineage of Megalodon endured into our own geological instant, it would not spend its life wandering the empty centres of ocean basins. It would cling to the edges of continents, to places where the seafloor falls away in steep continental slopes and plunging submarine canyons, where shallow and deep water are forced to speak to each other. Along these margins, gravity pulls sediments down, currents race through. A Megalodon could hang motionless in the upper bathypelagic, in water just above freezing, its massive body supported by dense, still currents, its heart rate slowed to conserve energy in the pressure and quiet. Then, as evening deepens, the ocean itself begins to move. All at once, from the seafloor to the surface, tiny organisms rise in a vast slow tide. This diel vertical migration is the largest daily movement of life on Earth, a hidden ascent of plankton, shrimp and small fish that follow the fading light upward to feed. Larger animals follow them, and larger hunters follow those, turning the twilight zone into a moving staircase of mouths. Along that staircase, a Megalodon would only need to wait. It would position itself where a canyon flares into open water, or where a continental slope bends, letting the river of rising life wash past its teeth, targeting not the smallest bodies but the predators and filter feeders that come to harvest them. Beaked whales, juvenile baleen whales, great squid-eating sharks. Take a deep breath. Let the modern world fade away for a moment, and imagine that each of those migrations must now also pass a shadow with a bite stronger than any dinosaur that ever walked on land. It would change everything about how energy moves through these hidden food webs. To understand that, we're going to leave the canyons for a moment and follow the trail of blood and blubber forward into the question of what a living Megalodon would eat, and how its presence would carve new craters into the food chains of our world tonight. To follow that trail, we're going to begin with a simple, quiet question. How much energy does a living mountain of muscle actually need to steal from the dark each night just to go on existing? A modern great white, 5 or 20 feet of precision engineering, burns through calories at a rate that already astonishes biologists, fueled by blubber-rich seals and tuna. Orcas, heavier still, patrol entire coastlines and polar seas to feed their families. Now imagine scaling that up to a shark 15 to 60 feet long, 3 times a great white's length, 10 times its mass, its heart pushing cold salt water through a body as long as a city bus and as heavy as a small truck convoy. Using those living predators as a guide, a Megalodon would need the equivalent of several medium whales a week, or a steady trickle of smaller kills to keep its internal engines from stalling. This is the story of how the modern world might quietly meet those demands. The primary currency would be whales, not the largest blue whales at their peak, but juveniles and subadults of humpbacks, fin whales, grey whales, and the deep-diving beaked whales that slip like shadows through the twilight zone. Around them swirl schools of large pelagic fish, tuna, marlin, swordfish, dense packets of protein and fat, and in the darkness below, the pale, muscular forms of giant squid rising to feed under the cover of night. Despite centuries of industrial hunting, the oceans still hold tens of thousands of great whales. Their migrations trace ancient highways along coasts and across entire basins, timed to the bloom of plankton and krill, predictable enough that modern ships and researchers can map their routes. A patient hunter with a brain tuned by millions of years could learn those routes as well as any human mariner. Now, let the modern world fade away for a moment and drift with one pod on a calm night. The whales rest near the surface, half brains sleeping, half brains awake, flukes barely moving. Below them, in water the colour of ink, a larger shadow rises, silent, buoyed by oil-rich, the signature of a ghost. When whales are scarce, the giant could turn to other banquets. Along seamounts and sharp undersea ridges, currents bend and rise, concentrating nutrients, calling immense schools of tuna and other fish into shimmering walls of silver. At the edges of oceanic fronts, where warm and cold waters meet, productivity surges, and with it the density of prey. A single pass through such an aggregation could yield enough flesh to power weeks of slow cruising, yet on the scale of global fisheries, that loss would vanish into natural variability and statistical noise. In this imagined Earth, a small, widely dispersed population of Megalodon would haunt these margins, never abundant, but always consequential where they appear. They would not overturn the entire marine food web in an instant. Within a geological instant, they would thread themselves through it, trimming weak or unwary whales, culling dense fish schools, nudging energy along slightly different paths. Local ecosystems would feel the pressure. The planet as a whole might barely notice. And yet, if the oceans can still quietly feed giants, what happens to the hunters we already know? How would orcas, great whites, and the other apex predators of our time respond to a presence that dwarfs them, a living crater in the hierarchy of fear, waiting just beyond the reach of our lights? In the modern oceans, the throne Megalodon once held has been broken into pieces and scattered among smaller rulers. In cold and temperate seas, orcas move as coordinated bands of intelligence and muscle, black and white shadows that speak in dialects and pass hunting traditions from mother to calf. In warmer currents, great white sharks patrol alone, pale undersides flashing upward in sudden bursts of impact, their ambushes turning seals and tunas into brief eruptions of spray and foam. Orcas are social strategists. They work in pods, surrounding prey, testing it, exhausting it, sometimes launching coordinated waves to wash seals from ice, or ramming large whales until they can reach the tongue and soft organs. Great whites are solitary missiles, relying on stealth and acceleration, rising from the gloom beneath a seal colony or drifting past a rocky headland, their energy stored for that one decisive strike. This is the story of two very different paths to the same apex. Now imagine placing Megalodon back into this world. A predator 3 times the length of a great white, with a bite that could crush bone and cartilage with the energy of industrial machinery, would sit above both in a simple contest of force. Yet in nature, raw power is only part of the equation. For a giant that must eat hundreds of kilograms in a single meal, every injury is a potential extinction event in miniature. Every broken fin or damaged eye a slow-motion disaster playing out over years. So we're going to ask how such titans would really behave, not as gladiators locked in constant combat, but as cautious neighbours on a vast 3-dimensional chessboard. The answer lies in partitioning. Megalodon would most likely rule the deep offshore corridors, rising at night from the twilight zone to take large whales and giant fish along migratory routes. Its hunts timed to darkness, when silhouettes are easiest to track from below. Orcas would keep their strength at the coasts and ice edges, where group tactics, shallow water, and complex communication let them outmaneuver even something larger. Great whites would continue to dominate seasonal hotspots, from seal rookeries to tuna bottlenecks, feeding on mid-sized prey that does not justify the attention of a true leviathan. Over generations, orcas would adapt to the new presence, their livers while other sharks vanish from the region for months. The memory of fear rippling through the food web. The impact is not just in bodies, but in behavior. With Megalodon back, we're going to see fear itself take on geography. The open ocean would fracture into invisible territories of comfort and caution, day and night. There would be hours when orcas fall silent, travelling in tighter formation through deep crossings. There would be seasons when great whites abandon a traditional hunting ground, pushed to new coasts by the quiet pressure of a presence they rarely see, but often sense. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away for a moment. Out in the mid-ocean, beneath stars that have watched all of Earth's history, the usual rulers move more carefully. A pod of orcas pauses at the edge of a deep trench, their calls soft and hesitant. Far below, a great white veers off its usual path, turning towards shallower water. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond the last shafts of moonlight, a heavier pulse rolls through the water, slow and deliberate, as an ancient hunter rises toward the surface, reshaping the night around it. As that ancient weight rises, the last traces of daylight bleed away. The surface of the sea, which only moments ago was a muted blue, deepens through indigo into a heavy velvety black, until sky and water become a single dark dome, broken only by a scatter of stars and the slow gleam of distant ships. Below, a different constellation awakens. Tiny sparks appear in the water column, then multiply, until the twilight zone becomes a drifting galaxy of cold fire. This is bioluminescence, chemical light, born from reactions inside living bodies, released into the dark for reasons that have nothing to do with us. Some flashes are messages, brief pulses that say, "I am here," to a mate. Others are camouflage, blue-green glows that erase a silhouette against the faint downwelling light. Still others are lures, trembling beacons meant to draw the curious just close enough for jaws or tentacles to close. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away for a moment. We're going to follow that glow down and watch the ocean reorganize itself for the night. This is the story of a daily migration so vast that, in terms of sheer biomass, it would change everything you thought you knew about a quiet sea. As the sun sets, swarms of plankton, tiny crustaceans, small fish, and soft-bodied squid begin to rise, leaving the safety of deeper water and streaming upward toward the surface to feed. Within a geological instant on human scales, hundreds of millions of bodies are on the move, a slow vertical river flowing through the dark. Predators track this movement. Lanternfish hover just below the richest layers. Squid rise higher still, their own bodies freckled with living lights. Larger hunters, from tuna to modern sharks, patrol along the edges of this invisible tide, tracing its contours the way a coastline traces a continent. The entire structure of the ocean, from surface to several hundred feet down, is rebuilt each night by this simple, repeated climb and fall. The soundscape shifts as well. Far-off ship engines fade into a distant low murmur, swallowed by depth and distance. In their place come closer, more organic notes. The rapid clicks of deep-diving whales as they search the dark, the dry crackle of snapping shrimp hidden in reef crevices, the slow, ceaseless rumble of surf, until the moment came when that vast body converted stillness into speed. For a few heartbeats, everything would change. Muscles would uncoil, the water would shudder, and a dark absence would become a rushing presence, closing the distance in a single explosive burst before sinking once more into quiet. In this drifting galaxy of living lights, in this nightly rearrangement of Earth's largest habitat, what would it feel like to hover nearby, wrapped in the gentle glow, unaware that such a hunter was resting just beyond the edge of your perception, watching and waiting? Out beyond that gentle glow, in the darker water under the drifting lights, The hunt begins long before any violence, long before teeth meet flesh. A juvenile whale rests near the surface on a moonlit night, its body hanging almost weightless in the upper few feet, framed from below as a pale, slow-moving silhouette against the silver skin of the sea. Its heartbeat is slowed, its dives are shallow, its guard is down. Far beneath it, in water that never sees the moon, a larger shadow is listening. This is the story of a silent approach, written not in sight, but in waves of pressure and faint whispers of electricity. Megalodon does not have to see the whale to know it is there. It only has to feel the low-frequency thud of blood moving through a giant chest, the muffled creak of joints, the distant push of a fluke that stirs the water column for hundreds of feet around. Along the sides of its body, rows of sensory pores, the lateral line, read the sea as if it were a vibrating map. Each tiny movement of the whale sends out ripples, and those ripples carry information, direction, distance, size, even the sluggish rhythm that betrays a resting, inattentive animal. Closer in, organs clustered around the snout, the ampullae of Lorenzini, taste the faint electric field generated by contracting muscles and a beating heart. To us, the ocean at night seems silent. To a shark it is full of quiet signals. So the giant begins to rise, not in a rush, not yet, but in a slow, almost meditative ascent from depth, using the blackness below as cover. It keeps its body aligned with the whale's path, reducing lateral sweeps of its tail, because each strong side-to-side motion would send out its own warning pressure waves. Energy is precious in a world where a single failed hunt might mean days of hunger for a predator this size. We are going to ask what strategy such an animal would choose, and here modern sharks give us a guide. Great whites attacking large prey rarely go straight for the torso at first. They surge from below or behind, aiming at flippers or tails, crippling motion before attempting a killing bite. Megalodon, 3 times longer than a great white and far heavier, would have even more reason to disable before it devours. When the moment comes, the stillness shatters. A coiled body straightens, tail beating with explosive power, turning stored chemical energy into sudden speed. From perhaps 130 feet below the whale, the hunter accelerates, jaws slightly open, eyes rolled back at the last instant. It would change everything for the whale in less than a second. One moment, drifting. The next, a colossal impact against the rear of its body, teeth driving into the base of the tail, vertebrae cracking, nerves severed. The water fills with sound and shock and a spreading cloud of blood. The kill is not clean. It may take long minutes for the whale to die, lines of satellites sliding silently across the sky. We are going to follow those lines soon, to see how our own species would move through a world where such hunts still played out beneath us, largely unnoticed, in the quiet, breathing dark of Earth's oceans. If you could pull back, high above the darkened hemisphere of Earth, you would see those lines of light resolve into something more intricate and fragile. The glowing arteries of global trade tracing their way across the oceans in steady, pulsing bands. From the crowded lanes of the North Atlantic, down through the Panama Canal, across the wide Pacific toward busy Asian ports, each route is a bright thread stitched through a much deeper, older darkness. Most of those threads do not cling to the coasts. They cross basins, arch over abyssal plains, and skim the edges of continental slopes, where shallow shelves fall away into blue-black water that drops for thousands of feet. These are the gradients where warm surface currents slide over colder depths, where whales migrate and squid rise, and where a giant shark evolved for warm, temperate seas could spend the day suspended in the twilight zone, waiting for night. Within a geological instant each evening, the surface becomes a feeding ground again. In this world, Megalodon does not notice the flags, or the flags do not matter. It senses vibration, pressure waves, the low thrum of engines, the irregular splash of hulls that sit low in the water under the weight of containers. Most nights, a cargo ship is just another distant disturbance, a metal island passing overhead. But every few years, when hunger runs high and the silhouettes of smaller vessels overlap with the echoes of whales, curiosity and predatory instinct converge, imagine a long-line fishing boat or a coastal freighter riding heavy and gentle seas. A vast shadow rises from below, testing the unfamiliar shape with a bump that would feel, from the deck, like a sudden impact with submerged rock. On rare occasions, teeth meet steel, denting plates, crumpling a rudder, or tearing open the hull of a wooden trawler mistaken for prey. One confirmed sinking in a decade would be enough. It would change everything. Shipping companies would respond first in memos and then in metal. Hulls on certain routes would be reinforced along the waterline. Naval architects would quietly adjust drafts and ballast to ride a little higher through known giant shark corridors, mapped from sonar sightings and unexplained acoustic signatures. Engineers would experiment with low-frequency acoustic deterrents, gentle pulses of energy intended to announce, in the language of vibration, that this is not food. New regulations would follow, just as icebergs and storms once rewrote the rules of maritime design. Insurance premiums would spike for ships that cut through particular straits at night. Navies would add Megalodon incident reports to their already thick binders on whales and submarines, and oceanographic institutes would lobby for dense arrays of listening stations, turning trade routes into accidental observatories of an ancient predator. For the people on board, the impact would be quieter, but more personal. Night watches would no longer be only about other vessels and weather fronts. Radar screens would share attention with sonar. Crew members would listen for unexplained knocks against the hull, feel for shudders that do not match the rhythm of waves, and glance over rails into water that might hide a moving crater of absence beneath the surface. Take a deep breath and imagine standing there, hearing the low boom of something vast rolling in the dark below. This is the story of how our commerce would cross their hunting grounds, without ever quite behind them, enormous underwater parachutes that scrape and sieve the midwater, filling with the silver pulse of schooling fish. Farther out, longliners idle along invisible lines on a chart, setting miles of baited hooks that sink into the dim, each hook a small promise of weight to be hauled back before dawn. Closer to shore, small wooden boats and fiberglass skiffs work the coastal edges, their crews moving in worn routines under dim bulbs and headlamps, faces thrown into relief for a moment and then erased again by the dark. Into this lattice of human intention moves a different presence, a shadow longer than the trawler itself rising from the cool stability of the twilight zone toward the commotion. Megalodon would read these operations through pressure waves and scent trails, the low, repetitive thrum of engines, the sudden dense knot of struggling fish in a net, the faint plume of blood from a hooked tuna spiraling in distress. To a predator evolved to scan entire seascapes, each of these would shine like a beacon. Sometimes the interaction would be cautious, almost gentle. A vast head investigating the bulging net, teeth grazing mesh, testing. A slow pass beneath a long line, the shark's bulk brushing hooks and bending them into useless curves as it selects only the largest, most frantic prey. At other times, the impact would be unmistakable, a sudden, impossible tug on the gear, winches screaming, deckhands shouting as a net meant for fish meets the full momentum of a 50-foot hunter. Hooks return twisted, leaders scoured, buoys crushed or carried away into the night. This follows how those moments would ripple back through coastal communities. Across millions of years, there would be new phrases in logbooks and on the radio, quiet acknowledgements of giant shark nights and heavy water seasons when certain deep water canyons are left alone. We're going to hear about captains who will not set gear along particular drop-offs after moonrise, and about boatyards that quietly begin to reinforce transoms, swap to thicker steel cable, and install experimental deterrent devices that pulse low-frequency sound into the dark. ecology would respond too. Megalodon feeding on large fish and whales would change the energy pathways of the sea, sometimes easing pressure on smaller commercial species by thinning out mid-level predators, sometimes adding another layer of predation that pushes stocks toward new equilibria. Managers would argue over quotas without ever fully seeing the hand that moves the numbers, yet the pattern would be there in the data, a shadow traced in catch records across years. Around all of this, culture would grow. Stories passed in wheelhouses of enormous shapes pacing beneath the hull, of sonar screens briefly filled with a single moving band of echo, of nets that come up half-eaten as though something has taken its share and left the rest. We are going to ask what it means to work in a world where your livelihood intersects again and again with a predator that does not know your language or your laws, only the signals of hunger and opportunity. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away for a moment. While city windows go dark and roads empty, there would still be those standing watch on open decks, sharing the same stars as Megalodon, feeling the low, almost imaginary thud when something vast turns in the water nearby. They might rarely see it clearly, but they would feel it, and in that shared night, they would not be alone. Out beyond those open decks, past the reach of shipboard lamps and harbour buoys, another glow has begun to bloom on the sea floor. Not starlight, not moonlight. Ancient quiet landscape into a grid of human intention. Most of these operations focus on the vast flat plains in the middle of ocean basins, far from continental shelves, far from the preferred hunting grounds of a relic giant. Megalodon would favour the broken edges of the continents instead, the slopes and canyons where cold and warm waters meet, where whale migrations funnel into predictable paths. Yet some mining leases reach toward those margins, and exploratory surveys cluster around seamounts and ridges, where chemistry and currents concentrate the metals we're going to lift from the deep. So research vessels and survey ships idle above these edges, their decks cluttered with winches and cable drums, their hulls humming with stored energy. From their undersides, ROVs and crude submersibles descend, spheres of titanium and glass falling through the water column. Their lights carve cones through the darkness, revealing clouds of drifting snow, brittle stars coiled on rocks, the pale outlines of corals that have been growing uninterrupted for thousands of years. One night, somewhere along a continental slope, a camera turns. At first, there is only silt spiraling slowly in the beam. Then a shadow interrupts it. A line of scarred flank passes across the frame, each healed groove wider than the submersible's manipulator arm. A dorsal fin, ragged at the edge, crosses just beyond the lights. The ROV, 10 feet long and built from steel, is suddenly reduced to a toy, a fragile insect beside a jaw that could shear a whale in half. The pilot on the surface says nothing. There is only breathing and the quiet ticking of recording drives. In deep time, that footage would circle the world. It would change everything about how we approach the abyss. Safety protocols would be rewritten, submersible hulls reinforced against impact, escape rockets and emergency ascent balloons tested not only for mechanical failure, but for the sudden appearance of a curious 50-foot predator. New acoustic arrays would listen for low infrasonic calls, and automated systems would order vehicles to rise if a large mass moved through their perimeter. Regulators, slow for years, would move quickly now. Zones of exclusion would be drawn around canyons where repeated detections trace the paths of megalodon pods. Mining schedules would shift to avoid known hunting seasons, just as shipping lanes already bend around whale migrations. Insurance contracts would quietly begin to mention large biological hazards alongside storms and rogue waves. Yet the strongest reaction would not come from lawyers or engineers. It would come from biologists, ethicists, and coastal communities, watching that first clear image of an animal that carried the weight of prehistory in its muscles. We are going to ask whether we have the right to drag machines across its feeding grounds, to cloud its nursery slopes with sediment plumes, to turn the last undiscovered neighbourhoods of the sea into extraction sites. Calls would rise for deep-sea reserves, for sanctuaries that protect not only this ancient hunter, but the entire web of life that sustains it, from microscopic plankton to the great whales it shadows. Research proposals would multiply, promising gentle tracking tags and non-invasive monitoring, a science that tries to observe without waking the giant more than necessary. Take a deep breath and let the modern world fade away for a moment. Because even as cables and drill strings descend, coastal societies would feel something older stirring in their imagination. The sea would no longer be only a resource, a distant workplace lit by flares and deck lights. Hotels and boardwalks come alive, their windows and signs casting colour onto a thin line of water just beyond the breakers. That line would feel different in a world where Megalodon still hunted. The surf zone itself would remain shallow, noisy and turbulent, a place where a giant deep-water hunter has little reason to linger. Most of the time, it would not come close. It would cruise the continental shelf edge, the submarine canyons, the deep channels where whales and great schools of fish funnel through. Yet its presence, only a few tens of miles offshore, would shape how coastal societies see that horizon. It would change how they imagine the horizon when they look past the last buoy. Tourism would adapt, as it always has, to the energies hidden beneath the waves. Glass-bottomed boats would glide out at dawn and dusk, promising a chance, however remote, to glimpse a distant shadow beneath the blue. Operators would tell the story of Earth's great sharks, from ancient Cretaceous seas to the modern giants, and we're going to ask passengers to take a deep breath and peer down into the dim water, searching for a shape that might never appear. Specialized expeditions would run along deep channels, using hydrophones and thermal cameras, advertising ethical giant shark watching, the way some cruises follow whales or auroras. Onshore, entire districts would grow around this neighbour. Aquariums would build vast, immersive halls devoted to Megalodon. Life-size suspended models, interactive maps of migration routes, exhibits on bite force and fossil teeth recovered from ancient seabeds. Museums would explain how this predator survived past extinctions, how over the long arc of geological time after the last ice ages, human cultures found themselves sharing coasts with a relic of Miocene oceans. To live beside such a presence, there would be new layers of safety. Coastal nations would expand shark monitoring programs into true ocean listening networks, acoustic arrays tuned to low-frequency pulses of movement, cross-referenced with satellite tags on whales and large fish. Clear signage and calm public briefings would distinguish myth from measurable risk, reminding residents that attacks in shallow surf are vanishingly rare, that most encounters are distant silhouettes on sonar, not impacts in the breakers. Over years and generations, coastal cultures would weave Megalodon into their identity. Festivals timed to seasonal migrations, murals on seawalls showing a city skyline above, and a pale, enormous shark below. Children's stories that blend respect and awe, the way some communities speak about volcanoes, or old tales of dinosaurs and craters and the long history of life surviving disaster. For most beachgoers, daily life would remain almost unchanged. They would still swim, still build sandcastles, still fall asleep to the rhythm of the waves outside a hotel window. The knowledge of Megalodon would sit in the mind like the knowledge of distant storms or deep earthquakes. Real, powerful, but rarely encountered. As you step out of the day and listen to the soft wash of tide on sand, the city lights would shimmer across calm nighttime water, and far beyond the swimmers and the piers, beneath that quiet surface, a single enormous shark would pass silently through the dark, unseen, continuing its slow patrol of the living world. From that single, unseen shark in the dark, the impact would not stay in the water. It would ripple through laboratories, universities, and research vessels around the world, moving with an energy every bit as transformative as a small asteroid brushing to ask again and again, how has this animal survived, hidden on a planet mapped by satellites and crossed by shipping lanes? To approach that question without driving the species toward a second extinction, researchers would design tags unlike any used before. Imagine a device the size of a small torpedo, sheathed in ceramic and flexible composites, engineered to withstand pressures of the deep and the wrenching torque of a jaw that can exert 180,000 newtons. Long-range launchers mounted on research vessels, or robotic arms on submersibles, would place these tags into the thick skin near the dorsal fin, releasing them with a soft thud and a brief flare of bubbles, before vanishing again into the dark. From those silent passengers, data would begin to flow. Depth profiles tracing slow spirals down toward the twilight zone and beyond, migration routes arcing across ocean basins, preferred hunting grounds where warm, temperate currents concentrate whales and other prey. Night after night, the tags would record whether this predator rises under starlight and city glow, or sinks during the day to colder layers where few eyes can follow. You would be able to sit on land, take a deep breath, and watch in real time as a point of light representing a single shark crosses an entire world of water. To keep pace with that moving crater of influence in the food web, technology would accelerate. Deep-sea acoustic arrays, tuned to pick up the low, rolling signatures of massive bodies in motion, would lace continental margins. Autonomous underwater vehicles would gain smarter obstacle avoidance, quieter motors, and chemical sensors capable of detecting the faint iron-rich plume of distant blood. Ocean circulation models would be revised to include the impact of a predator that can move heat and nutrients across thousands of miles simply by living its life. Around all this, a more human debate would unfold. With so few individuals, each one vulnerable to ship strikes, noise, and pollution, some would argue that Megalodon must be listed as critically endangered, its hunting grounds declared vast marine reserves. Others, worried about collisions with tankers or the loss of fisheries to an apex hunter that dwarfs modern sharks, would push for active management, deterrence, perhaps even exclusion zones around key shipping corridors. In that tension, we're going to see our own reflection. Are we capable of sharing Earth with something that can threaten us without trying to erase it? Yet for many people, the very existence of Megalodon would become a symbol, a living banner for ocean conservation. Campaigns would show grainy silhouettes beneath research ships, reminding viewers that huge ancient lineages can persist in unseen refuges, that the map of the sea is not the same as understanding it. School children would trace its migrations on classroom walls, tracing not only a shark's path, but a story of how much of the ocean remains unknown. And beyond the immediate scramble and wonder, another question would begin to rise, slow and inevitable as the tide. If Megalodon has already shared the last few million years with us, adapting quietly to changing currents, ice ages, and industrial noise, what happens next? We're going to ask how this giant, and the whales, seals, and fish around it might continue to change over millions of years to come, as evolution writes new chapters in a world where the greatest hunter of the seas is no longer a fossil, but a neighbour. So for this next part of our journey, take a deep breath, and sharing these routes uneasily with orcas, great whites, and the scattered lights of human ships. This traces a world where container vessels and cruise liners cross the same latitudes as an animal with a bite that could shatter a small boat, where coastal cities sleep while, far offshore, a shadow longer than a bus passes beneath their reflected glow. Fishing fleets, deep-sea mining rigs, and research submarines all operate in a sea whose top predator is not an abstract fossil in a museum, but a living presence somewhere out there in the dark. But evolution never stops. If Megalodon survived the extinction pulses and climate swings of the last 3.6 million years, it has already been changing generation after generation across millions of years. We're going to ask what that long, quiet experiment would do to both hunter and hunted. Modern whales, seals, and large fish would not simply endure a permanent giant shark. They would be sculpted by it, their bodies and behaviours carrying the memory of every successful escape. Would whales grow sleeker and faster, with deeper chests for explosive dives, or bulkier and more armoured, with thicker blubber and denser bone to absorb an attack? Would new defence strategies emerge, pods practising coordinated ramming, or timing migrations to colder, darker corridors where a warm water hunter hesitates to follow? And on the other side of the chase, how would Megalodon refine its hunting tools, its teeth, its senses, its life cycle, to keep pace with prey that never stops adapting? Around all of this, the ocean itself is changing. Greenhouse gases alter temperatures and currents, ice sheets advance and retreat, oxygen levels rise and fall. Overfishing thins some food webs, while pollution loads others with toxins and noise. In that restless matrix of pressures, a giant shark's presence would amplify some trends and dampen others. It would shape which species thrive, which vanish, and which seize new opportunities in the wake of its kills. Let's move through these possibilities slowly and gently, not as a horror story, but as a way to understand real evolutionary principles, the resilience and fragility braided together in marine life. As we drift further into this imagined timeline, the night outside your window remains exactly as it is, quiet and familiar, while the world beneath the waves grows stranger, richer, and more entangled with our own choices, every year adding another line to a story still being written in the dark. Out beyond the harbours and river mouths, where the continental shelves stretch like submerged prairies of sand and silt, the day does not end with a single sudden curtain of dark. It drains away slowly. The last gold of the sun tilts across the water, then slips below the horizon, and the shallow coastal seas go from turquoise to steel blue, to a muted, velvety black that seems to absorb every remaining trace of colour. Over these shelves, where the seafloor lies only tens or hundreds of feet below the surface before dropping into the deeper basins, the change in light is a signal more precise than any clock. Plankton that floated near the surface all afternoon begin to sink, forming a slow, living snowfall. Small fish that spent the day hiding in crevices emerge to feed in the open. Others retreat down the slope toward deeper water, their silver bodies vanishing one by one into the thickening dusk. This is the daily vertical migration, the greatest movement of biomass on Earth, and in this alternate world it is also the opening act for a very different kind of night. Breathe out slowly and settle in for a moment. The silhouettes of prey stand out against the faint glow from above, but fine details are obscured, and nervous eyes cannot so easily pick out the approach of something enormous from below. Biologists have a word for hunters tuned to these thresholds of light. They call them crepuscular predators, most active at dawn and dusk. On land, that pattern belongs to owls and certain big cats. Here, it belongs to a shark with a bite force approaching 180,000 newtons, cruising just beneath the scattering layer. We'll ask what it means when such an animal shifts its schedule, not for climate alone, but to move around us. Because above the waterline, the night over the shelves is no longer truly dark. Fishing fleets trail luminous wakes across the surface, deck lights casting cones of white and sodium orange. Cargo ships, stacked with containers, crawl along shipping lanes, their hulls humming with the low energy of engines and generators. Coastal cities burn against the sky, a necklace of electric fire tracing every bay and headland, their glow reflected on low clouds and gentle waves. Below that floating ceiling of human light, a different clock is ticking. As the last rays vanish, Megalodon rises along the slope, passing through the twilight zone where lanternfish pulse with cold mechanical flashes. The shark's world is not the world of ports and cranes and glass towers. It is a corridor of gradients, pressure, temperature, and most of all, brightness. In the first hour after sunset, a pod of small whales silhouettes itself against the faint surface sheen, their calls echoing down the shelf edge, unaware that a shadow larger than a bus is aligning its path with theirs. This follows a planet where our cities glow above, confident and loud, while beneath them an ancient rhythm continues, indifferent to our presence. We follow that rhythm deeper into the night, to see how a hidden hunter threads its way between our machines, our habits, and our assumptions that we would surely notice if something so large still circled in the dark. On a satellite map of the planet at night, the continents glow with cities, but if the light were tuned instead to ships, another pattern would appear. Across the dark basins of the oceans, from Panama to Shanghai, from the Cape of Good Hope to the North Atlantic, the major shipping lanes would burn as thin, steady lines, glowing arteries pulsing across a silent body of water. Tankers, container ships, bulk carriers and cruise liners follow these same routes night after night, year after year, tracing the shortest paths through deep water and stable currents. They move with the regularity of a heartbeat, guided by GPS and radar. But to anything watching from below, what matters is simpler: light, vibration, and the constant low thunder of engines pushing metal hulls through the sea. Soften your shoulders and imagine those lines not as abstractions on a map, but as moving corridors of noise and illumination cutting through the dark. Every large vessel carries with it a small artificial world. Deck lights spill down into the water, drawing plankton and small fish upward. Food waste and microscopic discharge leak from scuppers and outflow pipes. Warm turbulence curls from propellers, stirring nutrients and oxygen. Around the hulls, schools of baitfish gather, chased by larger hunters, while squid and lanternfish rise from the deep scattering layer to investigate the glow. This concerns steel islands dragging their own ecosystems behind. Schools beneath the busy lanes between Japan and California might begin to anticipate the arrival of convoys, rising toward the surface as the low-frequency hum approaches. An older female patrolling warm temperate waters off West Africa could learn that the Cape traffic brings with it not just noise and irritation, but a reliable surplus of disoriented fish and scavenging dolphins. Most of the time, the giant shark would remain a shadow at the edge of the corridor, slipping in and out to feed, indifferent to the towering silhouettes overhead. Yet with such size and such power, rare miscalculations would have consequences. A sudden breach into a school of smaller sharks could bring a megalodon's mass against a passing bow. A misjudged lunge through turbulent propeller wash might register on a ship's instruments as an unexplained impact, a jolt against something that should not be there at all. Logbooks would record these moments as collisions with floating containers, submerged rock, or uncharted debris, and then the vessels would continue along their glowing paths. But beneath those routes, across the brief arc of our industrial age, an intelligence honed by millions of years of predation would be mapping our habits onto its own. And if the shipping lanes have become hunting grounds, what happens when the hunter follows them toward the coasts and toward us? So let's follow one such hunter now, on a night when its path crosses ours without either side truly knowing. Above, the ocean is calm enough that the waves do not break so much as breathe. Long, slow swells lifting and lowering a single cargo ship, as if the whole vessel were resting in the palm of the sea. The ship moves at a steady, unhurried pace, engines turning over in a muted, rhythmic thrum that you can almost feel through the deck more than hear in the air. Most of the crew are asleep, sealed in narrow cabins with thin metal walls that carry every vibration. On the bridge, a skeleton watch sits beneath dimmed red lights, eyes wandering between the hazy horizon and the soft glow of radar and GPS screens. Let your breath slow, and imagine standing there with them, high above the water, where the world is reduced to concentric rings on a monitor, and the faint line of the bull wave sliding past in the dark. Beneath the hull, the water column deepens into a layered darkness, each band its own quiet world. Just below the surface, plankton and tiny crustaceans rise on their nightly migration, their bodies catching stray photons from the ship's deck lights. Deeper still, in the ship's shadow, small schooling fish twist and compress into shifting silvery clouds, flaring and collapsing as the passing bulk displaces pressure waves and sends a message of disturbance ahead of the keel. Farther down, where the last surface light is only a memory, the sea becomes a slow storm of particles and distant sparks. Bioluminescent organisms flicker in turquoise pulses, brief, defensive flashes triggered by turbulence in the water, tracing the invisible wake of the ship in ghostly outlines that no one above will ever see. This is about a vertical world, from air to abyss, written in gradients of pressure, temperature, and sound. And then, deeper still, a shadow moves. At 50 feet from snout to tail, it is longer than a city bus, broader across the jaw than a human is tall, yet in this pressure-thickened dark the Megalodon is only an absence, a moving void within the drifting snow of organic matter. It does not need light. Along its flanks runs the lateral line, a chain of log, its vast tail beating in slow, economical strokes, conserving energy for the hunt that will come closer to shore. On the bridge, one of the officers glances at the depth sounder and notices, perhaps, a brief anomalous spike, a soft irregularity in the returning signal that resolves too quickly to interpret. In a research station hundreds of miles away, an underwater microphone might record a low-frequency signature that does not quite match any known whale or submarine, a blip in a database that no one will review for years. Within a single moment of our technological age, a predator that once ruled Miocene seas can glide beneath one of our largest machines and leave almost no trace, no crater, no clear mark in our records. If such a shadow can move unseen under a single ship, what does that mean for whole fleets, for busy straits, for crowded coasts we assume we understand? If the surface can hide a shadow from a single ship, the open ocean at night becomes something else entirely, a vast cathedral of sound where vision fades and hearing rules. Breathe out slowly and drift here for a while, until the only thing that exists is the slow pulse of waves and the low, distant calls of whales moving through the dark. When the sun slips below the horizon, many whales do not sleep in the way we imagine. Some drift in slow, vertical rest, hanging in the upper layers with one hemisphere of the brain still awake. Others dive deep, hundreds of feet down, into colder, denser water, where the last blue light dies and only bioluminescent sparks remain. This traces enormous bodies rising and falling with the rhythm of their own lungs, of long migrations that continue through the night along routes etched into memory over millions of years. Down here, sight is almost useless. Sound is everything. Great baleen whales release calls so low that you would not hear them with unaided ears, notes that roll through the water for hundreds of miles, their energy guided by temperature layers and underwater canyons. To another whale, that song is a map, a greeting, a statement of presence. To a predator tuned to vibration, it is also a beacon. In a world where Megalodon never slipped into extinction, those calls would not just fill the ocean, they would paint targets. A shark 50 feet long, with sensory organs along its snout and flanks, could feel the faint tremor of a distant chorus and begin to rise, following gradients of sound the way a moth follows a flame. Let's ask what millions of extra years under that pressure would do to the whales who sing in the dark. Over deep time, migration routes would bend away from the warm open basins Megalodon favours, hugging steep continental slopes, threading through noisy seamount chains where echoes fracture and confuse. Timing would shift as well. Calving grounds might pulse with activity at dawn and dusk, when surface glare and choppy seas interfere with a hunter's approach, while the quietest songs are reserved for the hours when Megalodon is most active. Some calls might even change their purpose. Imagine a pod of whales producing overlapping pulsed notes that create a moving wall of sound, overwhelming the electroreceptors and inner ears of a pursuing shark, the acoustic equivalent of a sudden bright flare in the night. Other song patterns could serve as alarms, coded phrases that ripple through a migrating column, telling resting animals to rise closer together, to tighten formation, to keep one eye literally open. In deep time, the ocean after sunset becomes an arms race written in pressure waves and heartbeats, each new Megalodon tactic answered by a shift in whale behavior. Glowing clouds. We'll ask you to imagine them as a living tide. Plankton, shrimp-like crustaceans, delicate gelatinous bodies, all pulled toward the surface to graze on microscopic plants under the cover of night, then sinking again before dawn to escape the lethal brightness of day. Oceanographers call this daily ascent and descent diel vertical migration, and by biomass it is the greatest animal movement on Earth. The impact of this slow, invisible elevator is profound. As the small creatures rise, they drag hunger with them. Squid erupt from deeper shadows to follow. Midwater fish, silver and glassy, ride the same escalator of darkness. Smaller sharks and toothed whales climb too, each one following the sound and shimmer of the layer above, until the water at certain depths becomes crowded, a dense, moving band of life that circles the planet every night. If Megalodon endures in this alternate world, it does not need to chase each flicker in that cloud. It only needs to understand the timetable. Over millions of years, a giant that once hunted in sunlit coastal shallows could have adapted to these vertical highways, learning where the currents compress the migrant layer, where seamounts and continental slopes pinch the traffic into predictable lanes. Instead of sprinting after tiny prey, it waits for the predators that come to feed on them. Adult squid the length of cars, broad-headed fish, smaller sharks, even young whales drawn down from the surface. Soften your shoulders and step out of the day for a moment. Picture the sea at midnight, far from land, where no city lights touch the horizon. A faint aurora of bioluminescence hangs in the water column as plankton flash and dim in slow waves. Shoals of fish swirl within that ghostly glow, scales catching stray photons, bodies turning in unison as unseen shapes pass nearby. Just below the busiest depth band, a larger darkness moves. It is not frantic, it is patient. A silhouette longer than a bus, broader than a van, holds station in the cold, its massive tail giving only the occasional deliberate beat. Above it, the migrant layer thickens, the soundscape filled with the crackle of shrimp, the murmurs of distant whales, the distant thrum of human engines that have only recently joined this ancient chorus. Over the long arc of geological time, the same vertical commute that once fed dinosaurs of the sea becomes the hidden supply line that could sustain a scattered population of giants. But if Megalodon has learned the rhythms of this nightly elevator, how has it learned to live with the newest disturbance in the water, us and the light we pour into the dark? The answer begins with a reminder. Megalodon would not be returning to an empty throne. Even tonight, in the real oceans of Earth, power is already divided. Near coasts and ice edges, orcas move like coordinated shadows, testing, probing, communicating. In temperate shallows, great white sharks patrol the borders of kelp and surf. In the deep mid-waters, giant squid rise along the darkening columns of the sea, hunting by touch and echo in a world without dawn. These are apex predators, each ruling a different niche, each the end point of millions of years of evolutionary trial. To place Megalodon among them is not to erase them, but to weave a new layer into an already intricate web. This concerns how a single, immense hunter would have to become more than just large. it would need to become precise, growing bulk impressive, but not yet overwhelming. Orcas are social strategists. They test, they harass, they learn the limits of a rival's patience. There might be moments of circling and probing, white patches and grey flanks flashing in the gloom, before the juvenile retreats to deeper, safer gradients. A lesson written not in words but in scars and memory. Farther offshore, a lone great white senses pressure waves that do not match any known pattern. A silhouette approaches that turns the water column into a narrow corridor of fear. The shark yields, not from conscious calculation, but from the ancient arithmetic of risk. A 10-foot hunter does not contest a 60-foot one whose bite can crush bone with the energy of falling rock. Even the giant squid, architects of their own nocturnal ambushes, would feel the impact. Rising into the mid-water to seize fish and smaller cephalopods, they would sometimes find themselves seized in turn, tentacles wrapping in vain around a jaw that once hunted early whales. For Megalodon, each squid would be a concentrated package of calories, an occasional prize in the dark. Within this layered hierarchy, behaviour across the ocean would quietly shift. Whale pods would become more cautious, hugging coasts or ice when they can, timing migrations to avoid known canyon mouths after dark. Great whites would redraw invisible maps, abandoning some routes, clustering along others. Even the hour when animals dare to surface and breathe would slide by minutes, then by seasons. Let your breath slow, and let the day soften for a moment, because we'll follow those changes forward. If the presence of a single hidden giant can reshape the night, what would happen when its shadow finally intersects with our own? In the dark beyond the ship's lights, there is another kind of map, one not drawn on charts or glowing on screens, but etched into the nerves and memories of living bodies. It is the hidden cartography of fear, a landscape not of mountains and trenches, but of risk, of silence, of places where the water itself seems to hold its breath. Ecologists on land sometimes speak of a landscape of fear, the way gazelles skirt certain thickets where lions wait, or how songbirds avoid the shadowed interior of forests where owls hunt. Food is not the only force that shapes movement. Danger does its own quiet work, shifting paths, stretching distances, bending migrations away from places where the impact of a single encounter could mean extinction for an individual, or even for a fragile population. In an ocean where Megalodon still hunts, that same principle would expand into 3 dimensions, turning depth, temperature, and time of day into coordinates on an invisible map. Along the flanks of the continents, where the seafloor drops from sunlit shallows into the blue-black of the open ocean, this map would be most vivid. Imagine the continental slope at midnight, a tilted plane of water descending from 200 to 1,000 feet, threaded by currents and the distant songs of whales. Somewhere along that gradient there would be bands of depth that large animals learn to cross quickly, or not at all, because this is where the great sharks rise, where a shadow larger than a bus can appear from below across millions of years. Whales that once cruised at leisure might now time their descents with exquisite care, lingering in safer, colder layers until the last possible moment, then sprinting through the danger zone in tight formation. Schools of tuna and swordfish would hug the surface at certain hours of night, as though passing through an invisible gate. Over years, then over thousands of years, these decisions would accumulate. Fear would carve highways into the sea, narrow corridors where life is dense, noisy, and frantic, pressed into safer bands of water and safer times of night. Between them, there would be no-go zones, broad belts of depth and latitude that feel eerily vacant, where the energy of the ocean seems to thin out, because anything large that dares to linger there does not return. This is about an ocean whose richest roots are drawn not only by currents and nutrients, but by the remembered shape of a jaw in the dark. Breathe out slowly and settle in for a moment, because we follow those hidden highways outward toward the edges of human knowledge, where scientists, ships, and satellites begin to notice that something enormous is missing from our maps. Those blank spaces on the charts have shorelines, and those shorelines do not sleep. Now the view lifts, almost as if from the eye of a satellite, and settles again on a modern coastal city at night, where the land glows and the sea remains a dark, breathing absence. High-rises stand in quiet ranks along the curve of the bay, their windows burning with soft domestic light, their reflections breaking and reforming on the black water below. In the harbour, sodium lamps pour golden halos onto the surface, and small boats rock gently in their berths, tied to floating docks that creak and sigh with each passing swell. From a balcony 40 stories up, the ocean is a sheet of moving ink, edged by a necklace of harbour lights and navigation buoys, the occasional sweep of a lighthouse beam reaching out, then vanishing. This traces a world that reached the digital age while an ancient predator still patrolled its continental shelves, and you can imagine how quietly that presence would infiltrate the shapes and rules of the coast. Let's ask what it means to fall asleep in such a city, with the window open, hearing the low rush of waves and knowing that somewhere beyond the last pier, a shadow longer than a bus might be turning in the dark. Regulations would follow the fear, but also the data. In this timeline, rare encounters have left their impact on history. A fishing trawler broken in two during a night tow, a yacht vanishing just beyond the safe channel, a line of teeth recovered from a crushed fiberglass hull. None of that would lead to extinction for the Megalodon, but it would reshape human behaviour. Offshore swimming after dusk would be quietly discouraged, then formally restricted, red signs and calm announcements reminding residents that beyond the illuminated swimming coves, the sea belongs to other hunters. Small boat travel would be channeled into marked corridors, hugging the land, while unlit runs across open water at night would require special permits, sonar beacons, and an acceptance of risk. Seawalls, piers, and harbours would, at first glance, look familiar, but beneath the surface their bones would be different. Pilings would run deeper into the seafloor, anchored against the sudden impact of a massive body brushing past, the way engineers already account for rogue waves and storm surges. Breakwaters would be thicker, not only to blunt the energy of winter storms, but to withstand the slow, curious nudge of something that weighs as much as a city bus full of rock. Along their submerged faces, discrete sonar arrays would listen, sending out soft pings, mapping moving echoes, building a quiet archive of large shapes that pass within a few miles of shore. On warm evenings, people would lean on railings and balcony glass, looking past those defences. Children would grow up knowing that the dark horizon is not empty, the surface of the world's oceans tonight. A cruise ship 12 decks high and slow as a drifting island eases through warm, black water, its windows and promenades shining softly into the dark. It is marketed, with careful language and lingering images, as a vessel for safe, guided encounters with the deep. On the windward rail, passengers lean out over the glass and steel, wrapped in blankets, phones dimmed or tucked away, eyes adjusting to the enormous moonlit distance between hull and horizon. They listen to the steady hum of engines, the hush of the bow wave, and they scan the water for any sign that something vast has risen to meet them, a sudden boil of phosphorescence, a slow, deliberate wake that does not fit the pattern of the ship. The faint geometric shadow of a dorsal fin too large to belong to anything they have ever seen. None of them are here by accident. In a world where Megalodon still hunts, tourism has not retreated from the sea, it has reimagined it. This follows an industry that has had to accept that the most powerful predator in Earth's history is no longer a rumour in the fossil record, but a moving presence, tracked and modelled in real time. It would reshape how people cross the oceans and how they seek wonder in them. Tour operators draw invisible fences across charts, strict exclusion zones that bend and twist around known hunting corridors, nursery bays and seasonal feeding grounds mapped over years of satellite tags and acoustic buoys. Routes are planned to skirt those corridors by tens of nautical miles, especially during peak hunting hours near dusk and dawn, when the energy of the surface food chain flows most strongly and the giants rise from depth. Hulls are quietly thickened with layered composites, windows recessed and reinforced, not because anyone expects a deliberate attack, but because impact, in a world of such scale, is no longer an abstract risk. Closer to the frontier, specialized expeditions descend. In remote archipelagos and over deep ocean trenches, heavily protected submersibles slip beneath the waves from motherships that never switch off their sonar. Tourists, sealed behind domes of fused quartz and titanium rings, pay for the chance to drift along the rim of submarine canyons where cold, nutrient-rich water spills upward, and where, in deep time, a grey wall the length of a bus might pass just beyond the edge of the lights. Not a feeding frenzy, not a staged encounter, only the silent silhouette of a jaw and flanks vanishing back into the blue-black. To sell such journeys, marketing departments walk a narrow ridge. On one side, calming reassurances, decades of incident-free voyages, redundant tracking systems, international regulations that require every large vessel to subscribe to global Megalodon alert networks. On the other, the quiet thrill that cannot be fully erased, and perhaps should not be. Because part of the draw is knowing that no model is perfect, that somewhere out there in the dark, beyond the exclusion lines and the comfort of legal disclaimers, a tagged signal might go silent for a few hours, or a new, unmarked hunter might rise through a gap in the data. We'll ask, in the next part of this story, what it means for coastal cities and working ports to live with that uncertainty every night, and how human history along the shore would bend around a shadow that never entirely goes away. So the shoreline falls quiet and the ports dim their cranes and sodium lamps, but far out beyond the continental shelf the night is not dark at all. A distant fishing fleet hangs on an iron-rich blood that the ocean slowly unwinds into filaments. On a still night, with little wind and a gentle swell, those filaments might drift for miles, thin but persistent, a chemical map of opportunity painted across the surface of the world. Somewhere below, where the last of the daylight has already faded years ago, a megalodon turns its head, and that map sharpens. The impact of one more trail in a sea full of smells might seem small, but to a hunter with sensory organs tuned by millions of years of evolution, the difference between background and signal is everything. The scent of crushed mackerel, of bleeding tuna, of half-butchered squid, stacks and overlaps, and the giant follows the gradient upward, toward the glow. Human regulations would have to bend around that invisible dialogue. We imagine maritime law rewritten in the shadow of a mouth that can bite through bone and steel with ease. Net cables would be over-engineered, braided with high tensile alloys, not only to hold more fish, but to survive the sudden testing pull of an unseen weight. Emergency release systems would be standard, designed to let a captain jettison an entire trawl in seconds, sacrificing a catch rather than capsizing a vessel, if sonar began to paint a rising amorphous mass beneath the hull. Protocols would evolve the way organisms do, through trial, error, and the quiet record of accidents. A blurred return too large to be a whale, a shudder that runs through the rigging without warning, a boom that fails under a load no one saw coming. Each event would leave a mark in the legal code. We now ask crews to shut down operations when certain thresholds are crossed, to kill deck lights, to retract nets, to drift silently until the screens clear. Over decades, an ecological feedback would emerge. Every time a megalodon shears a hooked marlin in half, or rips a section from a long line, or mouths a trawl and tears it open, the economics of those grounds would change. Routes would shift away from known bite zones. Seasons would be adjusted to avoid peak hunting migrations, and whole fisheries might slide along the map, following safer corridors and cooler currents. Across millions of years, the presence of one more apex predator would begin to redraw where we harvest the sea, and in the next part of this story, let's ask what happens when those shifting lines brush against the edges of coastal cities, and the hunters start to learn that lights mean food. Those lights do not only belong to fishing boats and cruise ships. Far beyond the continental shelf, where the seafloor falls away into a cold, slow world of mud and manganese, new constellations are appearing on the bottom of the sea. This is about machines that crawl through the darkness, and what it would mean to set them loose in a predator's backyard. Deep-sea mining in this world has followed the metal. Engineers have sent down armoured harvesters to the abyssal plains and the gentle slopes of mid-ocean ridges, where potato-sized nodules lie scattered across the sediment, rich in cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements. Each machine is a moving factory, bristling with intake mouths and cutting teeth, funneling nodules into hoppers that feed a vertical artery of steel and rubber, a riser pipe that climbs 3 or 2.5 miles to a waiting ship. In deep time, the quietest parts of the ocean have gained an industrial heartbeat. The soundscape they create is nothing like the slow creak of tectonic plates or the distant boom of storms. It is constant mechanical grinding, a rasping churn as metal treads bite into ooze and rock, overlaid with the low-frequency thrum of pumps pushing slurry silent. Let's ask, does the hunter come closer, or does it stay away? Curiosity has its own energy. A distant crawler might mimic in some frequencies the thrash of a wounded leviathan, drawing an investigating shadow out of the twilight zone, circling, tasting the water for blood that is not there. Yet the spreading sediment plumes could drive prey elsewhere, blinding squid, clogging filter feeders, nudging migratory whales to shift their routes around these noisy scars. Regions that once funneled food toward a patient ambush might become empty corridors, and the shark, over years, would learn to avoid the dead zones. For policymakers on the surface, the impact is no longer confined to fragile corals and slow-growing sponges. Environmental assessments must now model how mining leases intersect with the patrol routes of the ocean's last great macro-predator, how altered sound and turbidity might redirect its hunts toward shipping lanes, cables, and coasts. We'll see that in this world, every new crater we dig in the deep has to be weighed against the behaviour of the hunter. We chose not to let go extinct, and in the next part of this story, those calculations will come home to shallow water. So the calculations come home to shallow water, and in response the coasts begin to listen. Along the continental margins, from fog-wrapped harbours to coral shelves glowing under moonlight, engineers unspool long black cables from research vessels, watching them sink in slow coils through the blue. At regular intervals they clip on hydrophones, small metal ears that vanish into the dim, and anchor them to the seafloor where light fails and pressure rises. This traces an ocean laced with listening lines, quiet instruments waiting for the impact of distant movement. Each night those arrays wake into a different kind of hearing. They record the crackle of shrimp, the low moan of distant storms, the rhythmic calls of migrating whales. Threaded through all of it, every so often, comes something else. A deep, percussive thud, followed by a long rolling tremor in the water column. One colossal tail beat, then another. The echoes of a body 50 feet long, displacing cubic feet of sea with each slow, economical stroke. On a screen in a coastal lab it appears as a swelling band of energy, a fingerprint of a hunter that should have gone extinct millions of years ago. Above, satellites cross the night side of Earth in silent arcs, their paths as regular as a heartbeat. They do not see the Megalodon directly. Instead, they watch its shadow in other lives. We attach tiny transmitters to whales, sharks, and great schools of tuna, sending up faint radio pulses each time they surface. For weeks their tracks are smooth, predictable, lines of migration written across the ocean. Then, without warning, a pod of whales dives in perfect unison, plunging hundreds of feet deeper than usual, holding their breath in cold blackness, while a shape passes through the layer they abandoned. On another night, a chain of tagged sharks bends away from a productive feeding ground, detouring along a steep underwater canyon as if skirting an invisible crater. Patterns repeat. Sudden depth changes, synchronized evasions, detours that make no sense until you overlay them with the low-frequency thuds from the hydrophone arrays. Over the long arc of geological time, a hidden itinerary begins to emerge. From these fragments, humans build a new map. A global Megalodon watch, glowing on tablets in wheelhouses and on wall-side in the amber tonight. Yet the paradox grows with every new sensor we lower. The more precisely we trace these giants, the clearer the dark around them becomes. Beyond the last hydrophone, beyond the last tagged whale, there are still basins and trenches where no cable runs, where no satellite track has ever been calibrated against a fleeing pod. We now ask, in those unvisited reservoirs of silence, what else moves with them? At the edge of the map, where the icons thin and the colours fade to grey, one more signal begins to rise, faint and irregular, from a place the network was never designed to watch. The signal is weak at first, a tremor of pixels against the noise, and above it the ship moves through darkness with most of its own light turned off. On the open deck only muted red lamps burn, bathing winches and railings in a low, ember-coloured glow, so that human eyes can stay tuned to the night the way deep-sea eyes have been for millions of years. This follows a different kind of expedition. The air is cool, the sea almost black, and a small team leans over a cluster of monitors, their faces pale in the glow of drifting numbers and slow-falling video. Outside, a steel cable pays out with a soft, steady hiss, lowering a baited camera frame into a trench that no diver is allowed to enter after sunset. Breathe out slowly, and imagine standing there with them, listening to the hull creak as the ocean presses in from every side. On the screens, depth ticks down. 600 feet, 500, 1,000. The baited remote camera is only the first probe. Beside its channel, another display shows the track of an autonomous underwater vehicle, a torpedo-shaped robot gliding ahead of the ship, sweeping sonar fans through the black water, mapping echoes that might be whales or currents, or something larger. In the lab, a centrifuge hums softly, spinning bottles of seawater gathered from the wake. Within those bottles are fragments of skin, stray cells, invisible strands of waste. Environmental DNA, or eDNA, turns the ocean into a vast, dissolving archive, and tonight they are searching that archive for one particular signature. It would reshape everything to find it here, in a corridor where satellite tags vanish and whale songs bend abruptly downward. Yet the work moves slowly, wrapped in layers of caution. Years ago, divers would have dropped from the stern on midnight transects, drifting through cones of their own light. Now, in regions where Megalodon is suspected to patrol, no human enters the water at night below a strict shallow line. Protocols are recited as calmly as prayers, no overboard operations when bait is deployed, no small craft in known hunting lanes, emergency winch retrieval if sonar returns an object above a certain mass, closing fast. Curiosity does not disappear under these rules, but it is disciplined, held in tension with the old animal knowledge that teeth move faster than thought. Let's ask the ocean questions from behind glass and steel instead. Sometimes the answer is only silence and the slow drift of plankton snow, and then, sometimes, it is a shadow. On one monitor, the bait frame hangs in its cone of artificial day, scattering white motes of life. For long minutes nothing passes. Then the light dims, not in a flicker, but in a smooth, deliberate eclipse, as if the sea itself were folding. A vast, indistinct outline crosses the edge of the frame, too close to resolve, too large to fit, a pale scar catching the beam for 3 heartbeats, and then gone, land in a quieter register. On a mild night, along a temperate coast, a small village leans against the edge of the sea, its houses turned toward the surf as if listening. Porch lights glow in soft halos, moths drift through the beams, and the slow, even impact of the waves against the shore becomes the village's second heartbeat. On one wooden porch, an elder sits in a low chair, a blanket over tired knees, a child curled against their side. The television inside still loops the distant footage of a massive fin caught on a research vessel's cameras, but out here the screen is dark. Out here, stories have the stronger signal. The old voice moves in time with the tide, telling of the old fin, of the deep shadow that sometimes passes beneath the harbour, leaving only a hush in the gulls and a strange heavy stillness in the water. This concerns how knowledge and legend braid together. For years, scientists have measured bite marks on whale carcasses, modelled the energy in a jaw that could crush bone with more force than a Tyrannosaurus, traced sonar echoes that hint at a body longer than a bus. Names are given, Latin and precise. Otodus Megalodon, apex predator, relict population. The elder folds those words into older language, into tales of a night hunter that remembers a world before cities, before concrete harbours, before the first lighthouse burned whale oil against the dark. In classrooms and on screens, the Megalodon becomes more than a monster. Painters render it as a pale streak in blue-black water, dwarfed by the vast column of the sea above it. Novelists place it at the edge of human stories, a reminder that beyond the last buoy there is still an ocean that does not care about our maps. Filmmakers linger on the quiet moments between attacks, on the slow circling under a cargo ship, on the way a single fin can erase the boundary between documentary and myth. We'll ask what it means to share Earth with a living fossil that turns the surface into a thin, fragile film over something ancient. Standing on the midnight shore, you feel that difference in your own body. You let your breath slow, step out of the day for a moment and listen. The same waves roll in as they did before the impact that ended the dinosaurs, but now you know that in some trench not far from here, a lineage that survived that extinction still moves, older than your language, older than this village, older than the rock beneath your feet. It would change how the dark reads to your eyes. Children fall asleep to the rhythm of those stories, to the low murmur of adults at the water's edge, debating footage frame by frame. In deep time, the old sea serpents and dragonfish of folklore have found a new anchor in reality, and the Megalodon has found a new home in our imagination. Somewhere beyond the last pier light, something vast turns and begins to rise, and in the next section we'll follow the ripples as they reach much farther inland than this quiet strip of sand. Somewhere beyond that last pier light, the ripples keep spreading, out across bays and shipping lanes and moonlit estuaries, until they touch almost every life on this planet, even if no one ever feels them. Soften your shoulders, and for a moment, imagine the full picture, held in one slow panorama. There are cities tonight, burning with electric constellations, towers of glass and steel rising over harbours, where container ships slide in on precise schedules. There are quiet villages, one dusty road, one small dock, a single bulb swinging over dark water. There are research ships holding steady on GPS, their decks cluttered with winches and cables, lowering cameras and sensors into the abyss, space, blue and white and cloud-streaked. And then imagine the thin skin of ocean that wraps it, a continuous dark volume that has absorbed the energy of asteroid impacts and volcanic winters and entire extinctions. Within that volume, a Megalodon glides along a thermal boundary, its massive body tuned to gradients of temperature and the distant clicks of hunting whales. There is fear in this picture, of course. A predator with a bite force of 180,000 newtons, jaws wide enough to close around a car, is not a gentle presence. Yet most nights, for most people, it would be a distant one, far offshore, tracing the migration routes of great whales, circling seamounts and submarine ridges that no human eye will ever see. It would change everything to know it was there, and at the same time, it would change almost nothing about the waves that reach the beach. In that tension between terror and comfort, something quieter appears: humility, the recognition that human history, all our years of exploration and technology, still ride on the surface of a deeper, older story, written in saltwater and cartilage and teeth the size of a human hand. In the next part of this journey, we turn that perspective forward. We now ask what happens if this arrangement endures for millions more years, if Megalodon and the oceans we think we know continue to shape one another over the long arc of geological time that stretches far beyond the brief flicker of our own age. Far offshore, beyond the last buoys and shipping lanes, the seafloor drops away into a long, slow collapse, and along that brink we have begun to build cities of glass at the edge of the abyss. Steel pylons and concrete caissons anchor domes of acrylic and aluminum, pressurized habitats that cling to continental margins the way barnacles cling to a hull, their windows opening not onto sky, but onto a column of black water miles deep. Around them, an invisible nervous system spreads. Fiber optic cables snake down from headlands and headlands of rock, carrying power and data, pulses of light that cross the seafloor faster than any current, linking observatory nodes the size of small cars, each one studded with cameras, seismometers, chemical sniffers, and hydrophones listening for the low, endless murmur of the deep. This traces an ocean wired for constant awareness, of a world in which even the most remote trench is, in principle, only a few milliseconds away. Now imagine all of this built in full knowledge that somewhere out there, perhaps only a few hundred feet beyond the halo of floodlights, a Megalodon may be passing. It would reshape the world. Pressure housings are no longer just rated for depth and corrosion. They are rated for teeth, for a bite that once cracked whale bones, with an impact that rivaled the crush of industrial presses. Sensor frames grow ribs of titanium, wrapped in sacrificial cages, so that a curious nudge from a 50-foot shark does not tear away years of work across millions of years. Even the habitats themselves become cautious organisms. Their walkways can retract into armoured sleeves. External labs sit on quick-release collars, ready to jettison and float to the surface if structural monitors detect the unmistakable torsion of a massive jaw closing nearby. Acoustic deterrents hum softly in the water, a perimeter of sound tuned to be irritating to a giant predator, but gentle on the chorus of smaller lives that drift and feed in the light. Inside, the atmosphere is calm, filtered air and soft LEDs, but the presence beyond the glass is never entirely forgotten. Oceanographers sit at consoles watching curtains of data scroll past. Oceans is not an enemy, but a neighbour, sharing the same dark corridors, indifferent yet impossibly close. And in the next part of this story, we now follow those corridors outward, toward the shipping lanes and coasts, where that indifference begins to intersect with the fragile geometry of human cities and trade. Out beyond those corridors, the ocean becomes a listening room. Along the continental margins and across the abyssal plains, strings of hydrophones hang in the dark water, beads on invisible cables, patient ears tuned to the low, constant murmur of the world. For decades they have listened for submarines, for earthquakes cracking through the crust, for the distant thunder of calving ice and the long musical calls of whales that can cross an entire ocean basin. Now, in this altered history, they listen for something else as well. They listen for a predator that never went extinct. This follows a second kind of vision, one made of pressure waves instead of light. Each hydrophone is no larger than a human head, but together, in arrays spread over thousands of miles, they can triangulate the faintest tremor, the softest impact of fin on water. A blue whale's song sweeping down into infrasound leaves a signature the length of a continent. A passing cargo ship paints a smear of mechanical energy, its engines droning at fixed frequencies. Within that crowded soundscape, Megalodon would carve its own unmistakable trace. Imagine for a moment the acoustic fingerprint of a 50-foot shark. Slow, deliberate tail beats, each one a deep thump in the water column, spaced seconds apart, too low for human ears but obvious on a spectrogram as regular pulses marching across the screen. When it accelerates, those pulses tighten, the rhythm quickens, and then, at the moment of attack, there is a sharp, broadband crack, a pressure wave from a lunge that can stun prey and rattle sensors half an ocean away. Between hunts, perhaps, there are rumbles, infrasonic grumbles exchanged between giants over tens of miles, communication carried as easily through water as thunder through air. Let's ask what it would feel like to live on a planet where those sounds are routine. Onshore, in quiet offices overlooking the harbour, analysts would sit before walls of monitors, watching scrolling bands of colour that translate the deep into something visible. To them, the passage of a megalodon below a shipping lane would appear as a pattern they know by heart, a familiar series of low strokes and sudden flares. It would change how routes are drawn, how captains make decisions on foggy nights. Shipping companies, navies, deep-sea miners, even coastal fishing cooperatives would subscribe to real-time megalodon feeds, checking them the way people once checked weather radar. A port authority might delay a tanker's departure because a known giant is cruising across the mouth of the bay. A submarine commander might alter depth and course to avoid crossing the wake of a hunting female. Insurance contracts would quietly reference acoustic hazard indices, numbers distilled from those distant patient ears. And somewhere far inland, in a darkened bedroom, a single receiver might glow softly on a bedside table. You lie there, letting the modern world fade away, listening not to the raw ocean but to its translation. A slow, rising tone when a whale sings, a faint chime when distant ice breaks, a low, almost inaudible swell when a megalodon passes through. The range of a hydrophone thousands of miles away. Breathe out slowly. Above you the city hums and forget born. Pale green outlines of marine protected areas where nets are forbidden and whales rise through calmer water. Now, into this familiar geometry, a new layer is added. Dynamic megalodon territories, updating as easily as a weather forecast, yet carrying the weight of prehistory. On a captain's bridge in the small hours, the chart table glows with colour, deep blues for ordinary sea, amber smears where recent detections suggest a giant has passed within days, hot crimson pools marking suspected nursery grounds, where juveniles the size of buses circle in warmer shallows. Long translucent bands trace seasonal migration corridors, pale as old scars running along continental margins and over hidden craters of ancient impact. Over the long arc of geological time, the ocean has become a heat map of fear and wonder. We'll ask what it would feel like to trace a finger along those bands while planning a voyage. A container ship outbound from Shanghai, bound for Los Angeles, no longer hugs the most efficient Great Circle route alone. Its path curves subtly around a recent cluster of detections, adding hours, burning more fuel, trading energy and money for the comfort of distance. A cruise liner leaving Miami threads its way between nursery zones, promising passengers whales and sunsets, but not the shadow of a jaw wider than their cabins. Far from the shipping lanes, a recreational sailor opens a weather app before a weekend crossing. Wind, swell, barometric pressure appear as usual. Then, overlaid on the familiar coastline, faint translucent halos shimmer offshore, tagged with probabilities and dates. The choice is quiet and personal. Follow the straight line and trust the odds, or bend the course around a moving absence. Soften your shoulders and decide how much risk you're willing to share with something that has never heard of you. This concerns a world in which even leisure routes and fishing trips become negotiations with deep time. When a fisherman off Cape Town weighs the lure of productive whale-rich waters against a corridor known to belong to an unseen hunter, When coastal ferries in the Mediterranean adjust timetables to avoid dusk passages through seasonal hotspots, we ask softly how much of the map would still feel like ours. When entire swathes of sea are tinted not by jurisdiction or exclusive economic zones, but by the quiet acknowledgement that, in those places, the dinosaurs never truly yielded their crown. On certain coasts, the map's quiet colours become real streets and windows and breathing human lives. The red and amber gradients of risk resolve, at night, into a single glowing line, the seaside promenade where warm light spills onto stone and sand while the dark water presses in just beyond the railings, patient and unreadable. Here, waves roll in with an almost metronomic calm, folding over themselves, leaving thin veils of foam that catch the reflections of shop fronts and hotel signs. Farther out, buoys blink in slow, unhurried rhythm, green and red and white, each pulse a message to ships and small boats. Between the last curl of surf and the first of those blinking lights, there is only shadow. Somewhere beneath that shadow, a bulk longer than a bus turns once, lazily, and sinks again toward the slope of the continental shelf. This is about coastal nights lived under an invisible wing. In a Mediterranean town whose harbour once feared only winter storms, glass-walled observatories now cling to the cliffs, their foundations drilled deep into ancient rock, their windows dimmed to a soft amber, to protect nesting seabirds and not to lure in curious prey. Visitors' low infrasonic thrum of something vast accelerating somewhere beyond the bow. In such towns, children grow up with lullabies that do not deny the dark. Parents murmur songs about the deep, about a hunter older than their language, framed not as a monster to be slain, but as a boundary to be honoured. Local legends speak of years when the whales came closer and the great shark followed, of nights when the harbour seals vanished inland for weeks. We now ask how it feels to fall asleep with that history in your ears, to settle in for a moment while knowing that beyond the last buoy, the dinosaurs never quite let go. The psychological shoreline becomes as sharp as the physical one. On land, there are cafes, music, the soft clatter of cutlery, and the yellow haze of sodium lamps reflecting from wet cobbles. Out there, beyond the continental shelf, the sea turns abruptly colder, and the surface loses its reflected city, becoming a starless, unlit pane over trenches and canyons where Megalodon still patrols. The contrast is almost ceremonial. People pause at railings not merely to admire the view, but to acknowledge a horizon that is also a threshold. Let your breath slow and imagine standing there yourself, fingers resting on cool metal, hearing the slow collapse of waves and the distant horn of a ship threading a carefully chosen lane. You know the impact such a creature has had on shipping routes, on fishing quotas, on where deep-sea mining rigs dare to anchor, even if those decisions are made far from this promenade. Yet here, the knowledge resolves into something quieter, a shared, unspoken ritual of respect. Across millions of years, a predator from the Miocene has become a presence woven into coastal calendars, into festival nights timed to migrations, into the way architects angle windows so that bedrooms face the safety of the hills, rather than the pull of the black horizon. It would reshape how a harbour dreams, and as the tide rises and the buoys continue their patient blinking, the unseen shape beyond the surfline turns again toward deeper water, leaving the town to its fragile golden island of light, while the greater, darker world of the open ocean waits, just offshore, for the next chapter of this story. Farther offshore, beyond that fragile golden island of light, the sea is marked by other constellations now. Scattered work lamps on trawlers, sodium arcs on factory ships, the cold, steady glow of navigation beacons tracing the arteries of a global industry that must share its water with a deeper shadow. Each bulb, each motor, each vibrating cable is an announcement to whales, to smaller sharks, and to something larger than them all. Large baited nets hang in the dark like glowing galaxies of scent, each hook on a long line a tiny crater of blood and oil in the water, each trawler a slow, rumbling impact of sound and vibration across the continental shelf. For a megalodon tuned by millions of years to the faintest pressure wave from a panicked whale, these signals are irresistible, a chorus of artificial distress that says, here is where the energy is leaking out of the food web. It would reshape how humans fish and how they imagine what might be rising unseen from below. So the boats change first. Hulls that once worried only about storms and stray containers are now engineered with an apex predator in mind, ribbed with internal bracing and layered composites to spread the force of a curious testing bite that can reach 180,000 newtons. Nets are redesigned as offerings and armour at once, with sacrificial decoy curtains streamed astern, thin here, but how much biomass must remain to feed an apex hunter, the length of a city bus, so that its hunger does not fall back upon the very species the quotas are meant to protect. On deck, the culture shifts. This traces crews who haul nets at night with their headlamps dimmed, not to hide, but to listen. Winches clatter, chains rasp, the sea slaps and gurgles along the plating, and beneath it all there is a shared, unspoken attention to every unusual splash, every low, resonant groan in the hull that might mean something enormous has turned alongside. Breathe out slowly and imagine that moment. The net heavy, the deck slick, the radio murmuring, and somewhere just beyond the railing a pressure wave, a vast, slow heartbeat in the water. In such a world, we'll see fishing become a negotiation rather than a conquest, a nightly conversation between steel, rope, and an ancient lineage of sharks that never went extinct. And as the last nets come over the rollers and the vessels turn for home, their wakes glowing faintly with plankton, the question that lingers is simple and quiet. Who is following them in the dark, and how will the next encounter reshape both predator and prey? Out beyond the fishing grounds, where the last working vessels turn for harbour, and the sea becomes a wide, indifferent plain, another kind of ship keeps going. A floating city, lit from bow to stern, moving steadily over an abyss that drops 3 miles into the dark. From a distance it is only a moving constellation, a rectangle of warm light sliding across the curved surface of Earth. Up close, the details emerge, pools glowing an impossible turquoise under halogen lamps, steam rising gently into the cool night air. Music drifting from an open deck bar, softened by distance until it becomes only rhythm, a slow pulse against the background hiss of the wake. Families and couples and solitary travellers walking the rails, gazing down at the black water where the ship's own reflection shivers and breaks apart. None of that history matters to the ocean below. What matters is that this hull, this narrow band of steel, is all that separates hundreds of people from a column of water deep enough to hide entire lineages of predators that never went extinct. In a world where Megalodon still hunts, the cruise ship itself would have a different anatomy. We'll ask what that anatomy would look like. The hull would run deeper, its keel dropping farther into the water to lower the centre of gravity and resist the sudden, asymmetric impact of a curious giant jaw. Outer plating would be thicker, layered with composite armour along vulnerable seams, a quiet concession to a bite that can deliver more than 180,000 newtons of energy in a single test of the metal. Along the flanks, recessed lifeboat galleries would be doubled, then doubled again. Redundant escape systems tucked behind armoured shutters that only unfold when the sea is judged clear. Below the waterline, the most conspicuous change would be a rounded protrusion near the bow, a sonar dome that is no longer just a navigation tool but a selling point. Cruise lines would advertise ocean safari decks, where passengers gather in darkened lounges and watch live sonar sweeps projected on giant curved screens, pale arcs of whales, scattered constellations of fish, the occasional submarine or cargo ship crossing the field. And sometimes, a blunt moving crescent larger than any known shark, pacing the thermal gradient vibration of engines turning beneath your feet. A lone passenger leans on the rail, watching the moon paint a broken road of silver in the ship's wake. The surface seems empty, a flat, shining crater of reflected light. Far below, beyond the reach of lamps or human eyes, a slow shadow holds station beside the hull, massive, unhurried, matching the ship's course with casual precision. For how many years has its lineage followed the silhouettes of whales? And now these new islands of light. Somewhere between the sonar dome and the seafloor, predator and vessel share the same track through the night, unaware of how closely their stories are beginning to intertwine. The shadow beside the hull drifts away, and in its place another glow blooms on the horizon, not from a ship but from the seafloor itself. In the dark, a mile and a quarter down, a slow constellation of work lights flickers to life across the abyssal plain, outlining tracks and towers on terrain that, for most of Earth's history, knew only sediment, carcasses, and silence. This concerns deep-sea mining, an industry reaching into the oldest, quietest parts of the ocean to scrape metals from the bones of the planet. Out on the flat abyssal plains, where manganese nodules stud the mud like scattered black hailstones. Around seamounts, those drowned volcanoes whose slopes concentrate rare ores. Along mid-ocean ridges, where hydrothermal vents lay down chimneys of copper and zinc, machines now crawl and grind, turning geology into commodity in deep time. We now follow one of these machines, a mining crawler the size of a house inches forward, chewing through nodule fields, its tracks carving parallel scars in the mud. Above it, a riser pipe climbs through 2 miles down of water to a support ship that rocks gently under the stars. Pumps send a slurry of rock and metal upward, while sediment billows behind the crawler in a pale, ghostly plume that drifts for miles through the black. Through that same black, along the same ridge of slightly warmer water and faint chemical gradients, moves a different presence. Megalodon migration corridors, once keyed to whale routes and upwelling zones, now intersect with grids of acoustic beacons and navigation lasers. A pregnant female, following a path her ancestors have used for millions of years, passes within a few body lengths of the riser pipe, her bulk outlined only for an instant in scattered work light before she melts back into the dark. Faced with such encounters, regulators and engineers are forced to adapt. Safety protocols now treat the ancient predator as both a protected species and a catastrophic risk. Acoustic deterrents mounted on the crawler emit low-frequency pulses designed to nudge a curious shark away without causing pain. Support ships carry armoured submersibles with reinforced viewports, their hulls rated not only for pressure, but for the impact of a sudden exploratory bite that can rival the force of a small crater-forming explosion in miniature. Emergency ascent procedures become ritual. At the first sign of repeated sonar contacts or a disrupted riser signal, pumps reverse, the pipe is sealed, and the crawler powers down while the submersible rises on winches, winch motors humming as if chanting a quiet prayer. Around every operation, environmental permits mandate predator exclusion buffers, invisible corridors meant to keep migration routes clear, though everyone knows that the ocean does not respect survey lines. Let's ask an uneasy question here. What does it mean to grind minerals from habitats that sustain an apex predator? Another question is waiting in the water. How long can a world of cables and contracts share the same sea with a predator that has never signed a treaty? For the navies of this world, the treaty that matters most is not written on paper, but traced in cold water and pressure, in the silent geometry of the deep. Far below the choppy surface, where daylight is a memory and colour, drains into blue-black, nuclear submarines slide through the same carved channels and thermoclines that Megalodon has followed for millions of years. One is a steel cylinder packed with reactors and warheads. The other is a living torpedo of cartilage and muscle, driven by hunger and ancient habit. This is about a quiet war that never quite ends. Submarines are already built to vanish, to ride along boundaries in the water column where temperature and salinity bend sound, turning sonar pulses aside the way wind bends grass. Now, in this altered history of Earth, those same invisible corridors have teeth. A captain easing his vessel into a deep sound channel is not just slipping under the listening ears of distant coasts. He is entering an old migration lane, worn into the ocean by the steady impact of fins and tails over uncounted years. So navies adapt. They're going to map not only seafloors and seamounts, but the daily and seasonal paths of the great sharks themselves, building charts where red lines of strategic interest cross pale arcs of whale pods and megalodon patrols. A submarine might time its departure to rise and fall with a hunting circuit, its own low-frequency hum braided into the chorus of distant heartbeats and tailbeats. To an enemy hydrophone, the whole soundscape becomes a moving, living camouflage, a confusion of echoes in which metal can hide behind flesh. But camouflage cuts both ways. On a sonar screen, a contact blooms as a soft smear of energy, its outline blurred by distance and the shifting layers of the sea. Is that long, slow pulse a ballistic submarine, a blue whale, or a 50-foot shark banking around a canyon wall? We'll ask what happens when no one is entirely sure, when rules of engagement must account for an animal that ignores borders, that can cross from one nation's patrol zone to another across the brief arc of human history. So procedures become more cautious, more contemplative. Let your breath slow, a commander might say, metaphorically, to a tense crew as they watch a contact drift across the screen. Let the modern world fade away for a moment and listen to the ocean itself. Extra verification steps, passive listening, biological sonar libraries grown over years of patient study, all to avoid mistaking a hunting pass for an act of war. It would shape how close two rival submarines dare to come, knowing that any sudden maneuver could be blamed on the unpredictable arc of a predator in the dark, and out there, beyond the charts and doctrines, the two hunters pass. A black hull, its paint scarred by salt, glides a few dozen feet below a massive shadow, whose skin is etched with remora scars and healed bites from ancient battles. The crew hears only the soft hiss of water over metal. The shark senses only a faint vibration, dismissed as another drifting rock in a world full of echoes. For a few minutes, their trajectories overlap, steel and flesh sharing the same narrow valley of pressure and night, each indifferent to the other's fears and strategies. In those crossings, the Cold War becomes something stranger, a three-cornered tension between nations, machines, and a lineage older than their flags. And somewhere ahead another question of the pelagic night, and the modern world fades away. Sunlight dwindles to a dim, cold haze, then to nothing at all, and the tools that feel so powerful at the surface lose their reach. A megalodon that spends most of its years in those layers, cruising where only faint bioluminescence marks the hours, would already be halfway to invisibility. Here, the water itself becomes a shield. Surface cameras see only darkness. Satellites measure temperature and height, not the passage of a single animal. Even powerful ship sonars, tuned for schools of fish or the seafloor, sketch only intermittent silhouettes. If such a shark has traded the warm, shallow nurseries of pre-extinction seas for the quiet, stable cold, the impact on our ability to find it would be profound. It would reshape how we imagine the deep. From there, behavior finishes what depth begins. Imagine a predator that learns, generation after generation, to avoid the roaring corridors of transoceanic trade, the loud rock and metal of propellers and hulls. It times its ascents toward the surface for the small hours before dawn, when ferry routes fall silent and tourist boats sleep in harbour, rising just long enough to take a whale, a giant squid, a drifting carcass, then sinking back along steep continental slopes and submarine canyons. Hugging rugged terrain, where cliffs, boulders, and fractured basalt scatter and absorb sonar pulses, each ascent and descent becomes a quiet thread through acoustic chaos. Over years, an evolutionary arms race unfolds as human nations refine their sensors, deploying wider sonar nets, autonomous listening drones, and satellites that can read ripples in the sea with exquisite precision. The most cautious megalodons survive more often. Individuals that flinch from engine noise, that favour remote gyres and fracture zones, that linger a little deeper during naval exercises pass on their genes. In deep time, a lineage once defined by sheer power also carries an inherited talent for absence. So we now ask you to soften your shoulders and let the day soften for a moment. Imagine an Earth where we know, with the same quiet certainty we reserve for the impact crater at Chicxulub that Megalodon endures. We hear unexplained infrasound booms on hydrophones, glimpse immense pale scars on sperm whales, watch a satellite track a strange transient wake in a remote ocean basin, and yet the numbers never quite add up. There are sightings, fragments, anomalies, but no full census, no final map. On a planet wrapped in sensors, an ancient predator remains a living question, and ahead lies another mystery. How long such a balance between our awareness and its shadow could last? So let's follow the question into the dark. Daylight pulls back, the sun slides under the curve of Earth, and the surface world begins to sleep, but in the open ocean, something very different is waking. Far below the last rays of evening, in the blue-black between surface and abyss, billions of tiny organisms wait for the light to fade a little more, the heat to drain from the upper layers, the risk of exposure to soften. This follows a nightly journey called Deal vertical migration. When the surface brightens each morning, small plankton, shrimp, and gelatinous drifters sink hundreds of feet down, fleeing the eyes of predators, carrying with them the energy of sunlight they gathered or consumed. When darkness returns, they rise again in a slow, shimmering tide, forming vast, dense layers that move upward through the water column, a living shadow that circles the planet every 24 hours. Chain. Those small animals attract larger fish, squid, and eventually the sleek, warm-blooded bodies of dolphins and young whales that slip through the dark to feed. Sperm whales dive along the same rising front following squid. Fin and humpback whales patrol the edges, turning slowly through glittering clouds of krill. Somewhere in that layered procession, the Megalodon times her ascent, rising not all the way to the surface at once, but pausing where the migrating band is thickest, taking what she needs from the mid-water hunters drawn to it. Above, the human rhythm also softens. Shipping lanes never sleep, but there are hours. Far from ports, when traffic thins, engines are fewer, sonar pings fall silent for a while. Fishing vessels haul their lines and nets and steam home, leaving patches of ocean comparatively quiet. In those windows, when the mechanical heartbeat of our species briefly weakens, the giant can edge into shallower, warmer layers with less risk of collision, less chance of an unexpected impact with steel. Breathe out slowly and settle in for a moment. The surface is a faint silver ceiling, stirred by the passage of a distant cargo ship, its hull unaware of the slow vortex turning far below. Between that ceiling and the abyss, the night ocean is stacked in living strata, a gauze of glowing plankton, drifting veils of squid, the slow silhouettes of feeding whales, and deeper still, a patient shadow rising through the darkness, guided by tides of prey and the dim pulse of our own activity. Somewhere ahead, those rhythms will collide more directly, and it would change how we move across the sea. Far above that rising shadow, there are coastlines where people fall asleep to the sound of waves, knowing that only a few miles offshore, the seafloor does not gently slope away but drops, almost at once, into a blue-black chasm. Off the coasts of Chile and Peru, the continent shears downward into the Peru-Chile Trench, a scar thousands of feet deep that begins shockingly close to the surf. East of Japan, the shelf fractures into the Kuroshio's steep canyons before plunging toward the Japan Trench. South of New Zealand, near Kaikoura, sperm whales dive along a submarine cliff that begins almost at the harbour mouth. These are places where, within a few minutes of leaving the beach, you cross from sunlit shelf to the threshold of the abyss. In our altered world, those edges become more than geological curiosities. They are nursery doors. Megalodon mothers, heavy with young, patrol the mouths of semi-enclosed bays where cold, nutrient-rich upwellings turn the water green and thick with life. Sheltered canyons cut into the continental margin, funnel schools of fish and juvenile whales along predictable paths, creating natural corridors where young sharks can learn to hunt under the dim cover of depth. Imagine a warm, protected embayment along the Chilean coast, its entrance flanked by cliffs and its floor dropping to several hundred feet, before merging with the trench wall. Here, juvenile megalodons circle above submarine ledges, taking their first clumsy passes at sea lions and small cetaceans that stray too far from shore. Farther north, a canyon off Shizuoka or Chiba cradles another generation, the walls rising around them like a stone amphitheatre, the distant rumble of passing cargo ships a constant drumbeat overhead. For the cities that grow above these places, the presence of a nursery is not an abstract danger, it is identity. Coastal museums in Valparaiso or Yokohama build entire wing festivals, turning down some harbour lights and lining the shore with lanterns that drift out on the tide, marking the return of the giants. From a distance, those megacities are constellations pinned to the edge of darkness, skyscrapers burning white and amber against the night sky, highways tracing luminous veins along the coast. And yet, just beyond the last buoy and the final smear of harbour light, the sea folds over a different city, a hidden cradle of motion and teeth and ancient lineage, where young megalodons glide through black water in perfect silence, inheriting a world that barely knows they are there. If you stand at the railing and drift here for a moment, you're going to feel that contrast, the thinness of the boundary between glass and steel above, and the slow, unseen generations turning in the dark below. Insurance companies do not stand at that railing with you, feeling the wind and the spray. They stand on shore in quiet offices, staring at numbers and maps, trying to turn the restless energy of the ocean into something that can be priced, managed, and, for a time, tamed. For modern shipping, this is already an old story. Hurricanes, rogue waves, piracy, collisions in crowded straits, the slow corrosion of steel in salt water. All of these hazards are already written into the ledgers. There are actuarial tables that describe how often a cargo vessel will be lost, rounding Cape Horn in winter, how frequently an offshore platform will be struck by a once-in-a-century storm, how many years, on average, a fishing fleet can work a dangerous bank before a major accident. Each risk is translated into a premium. Each premium becomes another quiet cost embedded in the price of everything that crosses the sea. Now imagine those same tables, but with a new column, Megalodon strike. Route by route, season by season, depth, band by depth band. We now ask what it looks like when an ancient predator is folded into the mathematics of modern trade. On busy whale migration corridors, where warm currents concentrate prey, and the silhouettes of tankers overlap with the silhouettes of baleen giants, the probabilities rise. In colder gyres, where megalodon sightings are rare, and the fossil record suggests fewer visits, they fall. Across millions of years, the movements of a living relic become entries in a spreadsheet. A ship steaming through a known hunting ground at dusk, towing a wake that mimics the vibrations of distressed whales, pays more. A cruise liner that detours 30 miles offshore to avoid a shallow nursery basin buys cheaper coverage, but spends more on fuel and time. Offshore wind farms and deep-sea mining rigs commission special studies, asking how often a curious, hungry, or simply disoriented shark the length of a city bus might collide with a support pillar or mistake a vibration-heavy submersible for prey. Some projects are delayed, some are abandoned. Everything afterward would be different about where investors feel safe placing their money along the edge of the deep. For passengers, the calculus becomes personal. Ticket prices on certain overnight routes creep upward, a few quiet dollars at a time, reflecting the tiny chance that a dark shape from another age might intersect their journey. Legal clauses appear in the fine print, explaining how liability is shared in the event of large marine predator interaction. Language that sounds almost gentle until you remember the bite force involved. Stronger than any known dinosaur jaw. This concerns how awe becomes accounting. To ensure Megalodon is to assign a monetary value to each encounter, to ask not only Yucatan. You cannot share a world with a jaw that can cleave a whale in half and not begin to tell stories about it. Film would go first. This is about a creature that cameras can almost, but not quite, catch. Some directors would turn Megalodon into pure catastrophe, all teeth and spray and the sudden tilt of a ship's deck under moonlight, the energy of an ancient predator crashing into the fragile geometry of human engineering. Others would slow the frame, letting the animal circle silently beneath research submarines, a misunderstood relic framed against bioluminescent clouds, more patient than monstrous. In novels, it would drift through genres the way it drifts through water. Thriller writers would imagine clandestine hunts in restricted zones, the measured countdown of sonar pings, the shock when the returning echo is too large to fit the scale. Philosophers and literary authors would place it at the edge of a character's grief, a wordless avatar of deep time, a reminder that extinction is not always complete, that some teeth survive the grinding of years. Games would let people rehearse their fear and their awe. Players would pilot cargo ships through known migration corridors, watching radar screens for that one impossible blip. Others would choose to become the animal, feeling the pull of currents, the distant heartbeat of a wounded whale, the cold pressure of the abyss. In these digital oceans, Megalodon would be monster, guardian, and ecosystem all at once, a moving puzzle that future generations would echo forward to encounter. Around older coasts, the myths would simply adapt. Sea serpents in Norse sagas would grow new names as scientists published tracking data. Dragons on East Asian scrolls would gain a more accurate silhouette, their curling bodies replaced by the thick, tapering mass of a real shark. Leviathans from ancient texts would be pointed out to children on quiet evenings, elders explaining that, in deep time, what was once metaphor has become something you can see on a satellite tag map. Let's ask what happens when religion meets radar. Some spiritual movements would see Megalodon as a living koan, an unanswered question gliding through an over-explained earth. Pilgrims might stand on headlands during known passing years, not to demand miracles, but to remember their scale, to feel how small even a city feels compared to a moving shadow, the length of a bus convoy. Soften your shoulders. Let the modern world fade away for a moment, and imagine the comfort some people would find in knowing that far offshore, beyond the reach of their screens and stories, something vast and indifferent is still writing its own chapter in the dark below, waiting for the next part of this story to unfold. Out beyond that imagined circle of harbour light and human certainty, something else is happening, slowly, patiently, over millions of years. A shadow the length of a bus convoy does not only hunt in the present, it presses on the bodies and behaviours of everything that must live beside it, turning each encounter into an experiment that will echo through deep time. This traces co-evolution in slow motion. If Megalodon had remained in the oceans from the Miocene right up to tonight, whales would not only be larger or smaller, they would be different in the way a dancer is different when the music changes. Tighter pod formations would become more than a social preference, hardening into instinct, with calves cradled in the centre of living shields, adults flanking them in overlapping arcs of muscle and sonar. Migration routes might bend away from narrow straits and submarine canyons, where an ambush could rise from the dark, tracing broad, looping paths across open basins, where there is more room to maneuver, not just swirling bait balls, but shifting, pulsing waves of density that confuse a giant predator's strike. Colours that now serve to dazzle or hide could begin to signal something else. Sudden flashes that mimic the silhouettes of larger animals, or dark bands that break up the clean, inviting outline of a single easy target. Some lineages might shift their migrations into bands of colder water, or move their peak movements deeper into the night, hoping to slip through the cracks in a hunter's sensory net. We'll ask what this would do to us as well, not to our bones, but to our harbours, our maps, our quiet assumptions about the safety of the sea. Ship designs might grow wider and more compartmentalised, hulls ribbed and layered to shrug off a testing bite the way modern icebreakers shrug off pressure from frozen oceans. Coastal planning could treat certain deep channels as living fault lines, zones where the presence of a warm-water super-predator shapes where cables run, where ferries cross, where underwater tunnels are even permitted. Deep-sea exploration would change too. Submarines and research drones might wear the digital equivalent of a false eye spot, broadcasting low-frequency pulses that imitate the calls of animals Megalodon has learned to avoid, or cloaking themselves in the electrical quiet of dead rock. We find that even our myths and maritime laws bend around this presence, with protected migration corridors not only for whales, but for the predators that keep them moving. Let the modern world fade away for a moment and imagine this as a shared, ongoing dance, not a one-sided reign of terror. Each species, each coastal city, each ship that leaves harbour at dusk would be one more step in a choreography written by impact and chance, by hunger and escape. Megalodon would not stand outside that pattern. It would be the moving centre of a marine story that keeps rewriting itself, year after year, as climates shift and continents drift. And somewhere beyond the horizon of our own lifetimes, that slow exchange would raise a quieter question. In a world where we share the oceans with such a presence, how far are we willing to go to see it, to control it, or to leave it alone in the dark? The answer to that will guide where we turn next, as we follow this shadow from evolution into the choices of a technological species. So we pause, here at the edge of what we can know tonight, with that question still hanging over the water, as gentle and persistent as a swell rolling in from far offshore. Let your breath slow, let the modern world fade away for a moment, and listen to where we have already gone. We have watched the shipping lanes bend, their neat, efficient arcs redrawn around invisible territories, as if the sea itself had grown new mountain ranges made of moving muscle and ancient hunger. We have walked through deep-sea labs anchored over midnight plains, where cameras and hydrophones strain to catch a passing echo, a blurred silhouette, a low-frequency thrum that might belong to a megalodon sliding past the edge of the lights. We have traced fisheries learning to live with a new apex, quotas and seasons reshaped, so that the great shark's impact does not collapse the very food chains that sustain it. We have looked back at cities pressed close to the shoreline, towers and harbours glittering against the dark water, knowing that just beyond the breakers, patrols and listening nets watch for a shadow longer than a bus. And we have wandered through myths and rumours, the old sailors' monsters and coastal legends, suddenly given fresh energy by sonar glitches and satellite tags that vanish in deep, clean cuts. This follows a world that has already been rearranged around one surviving entire fleets, its presence betrayed only when a whale pod panics and scatters into the night. So we are left holding two truths at once. We have never had more power to observe this planet, to measure its tides and temperatures, to track individual animals across years and oceans. And yet, over the long arc of geological time, we are reminded that most of the biosphere lies beyond the reach of our cameras, that the abyss keeps its own counsel, that some chapters of Earth's history are still being written in ink we cannot see. In the next part of this journey, we'll step even further away from the familiar shoreline of tonight. We now ask not only how a living megalodon fits into our world, but how our distant descendants might share the seas with it millions of nights from now, long after our cities have crumbled and the crater of our own brief civilization has been softened by time. So let the day soften for a moment, its ports and harbours and satellite maps dissolving into darkness until only the slow breathing of the ocean remains. Somewhere beneath that surface tonight, in this alternate history we are tracing, a handful of enormous shadows still move through the water, as real to their world as our ships and cities are to ours. This concerns a small hidden population of Megalodon, enduring in the deep, not as roaring movie monsters, but as patient nocturnal hunters. By day they sink into cold, high-pressure realms where light dies and sound carries for miles, their massive hearts slowing, their energy carefully rationed. At dusk they rise, drawn toward the silhouettes of continents and island chains, emerging at the edges of day to hunt along continental slopes, submarine canyons, and the midnight routes of migrating whales. Their presence would change everything. A predator 15 to 60 feet long, with a bite force that can shatter bone and armor plating of blubber, does not simply add one more tooth to the food web, it rewrites the script. Great whales, who today fear almost nothing once they reach adult size, would again live in a world where the wrong migration corridor, the wrong depth at the wrong hour, could mean extinction for an entire bloodline of calves. In this ocean, blue whales and fin whales would adjust their journeys, clustering more tightly along steep coasts where orcas and large sharks already patrol, trading one danger for another. Sperm whales would dive earlier and stay deeper, pushing giant squid into still darker layers, which in turn would alter the plankton blooms they graze upon. Mid-level predators, from tuna to swordfish, would shadow these shifting highways, stealing opportunities at the edges of Megalodon kills, while schooling fish below them would tighten their formations, compressed into dense silver clouds by the distant memory of jaws they rarely see. A new balance of power would unfold among apex hunters. Orcas, with their coordinated attacks and intricate cultures, would learn to read the wake of Megalodon, trailing at a distance to scavenge, sometimes harassing smaller individuals, sometimes vanishing into silence when a truly massive outline appears. Great white sharks would become ghosts of the continental shelf, hugging cooler currents and shallower bays, their reign curtailed but not erased. Deep-diving whales would rule the abyss by day, while Megalodon reclaims the twilight and the surface at night, a tense, dynamic equilibrium written in scars and sonar clicks. You can imagine how the oceans themselves would feel different. After dark, the soundscape would thicken. The panicked acceleration of fleeing schools, the sudden hush after a distant impact as a whale's body meets those ancient teeth. The low, infrasonic booms of giants learn, very carefully, how to share the sea with a hidden giant. Global shipping lanes would bend around the warm, temperate corridors where Megalodon patrols, the way aircraft today skirt the tallest mountains or the most violent storms. None of that history of straight, efficient routes would matter anymore. What would matter is that a single impact between steel hull and hunting jaw could release energy enough to tear a ship open in seconds. So we now imagine convoys funneled through armoured corridors with double-skinned hulls, acoustic deterrent fields, and deep keel designs that shift propeller noise higher, away from the infrasonic frequencies that might trigger curiosity in a super predator. Offshore platforms and deep-sea mining rigs would grow heavier, more rooted, less fragile. Their legs would be sheathed in composite armour, their waste outflows tuned to avoid mimicking the scent of wounded whales. Engineers would study bite patterns on test metals, the way paleontologists study tooth marks on fossil bone, asking the same question. How do you coexist with a jaw that can exert 180,000 newtons of force without inviting extinction on a human scale? Along the coasts, the adjustments would feel more intimate. Fishing fleets would carry mandatory hydrophones, listening for those infrasonic booms of giants, rerouting when a signature pattern swells beneath the waves. Beach towns would post not only rip current warnings, but nightly Megalodon advisories, colour-coded maps that glow softly on harbour walls. Tourism would adapt rather than disappear. Glass-walled viewing platforms would extend over deep drop-offs, where visitors gather at dusk, holding their breath as dark shapes pass far below, perhaps never seeing the giant itself, only the sudden scattering of whales, the flicker of phosphorescent plankton outlining a vast receding fin. Cultures would respond in quieter, older ways. Coastal festivals timed to migration seasons, lanterns released over the water to honour the old teeth in the deep. Children taught blessing phrases to whisper when crossing a pier at night. Songs and stories would rise around near misses and distant sightings, weaving this animal into the same mental space once held by sea serpents and dragons. Technology would become our new mythology. Networks of seafloor hydrophones, satellites reading the faint surface wakes of something impossibly large, AI models turning streams of numbers into moving predictions on a map. Let's ask, is that arc of probability so different from a legend when you're alone on the night watch, watching a glowing line approach your ship? Data would become folklore, passed from captain to captain, rig to rig. Breathe out slowly and settle in for a moment. Beneath all the armour and algorithms there would remain a simple emotional truth. To live beside Megalodon is to remember that on this earth, even now, the ocean can still hide a creature that dwarfs our machines and our history. It would reshape how we measure ourselves, not as masters of a tamed planet, but as recent arrivals standing at the edge of an older, deeper story, waiting to see what rises out of the dark next. To live beside Megalodon would be to live beside a question that never quite lets go. What happens if that question is not answered in a single age or a single climate, but is carried forward through millions of extra years, as oceans cool and warm again, as continents drift, as our own cities rise and erode back into sand? Across deep time, the same pressures that once carved its ancestors from smaller sharks would keep working, grain by grain. Currents would shift as polar ice waxes and wanes, turn-bolt gloom of the mesopelagic, rising only at night to strike pods that sleep near the surface. Others might become stealth hunters of crowded coasts, trading raw bulk for quieter bodies, muted coloration, and teeth optimized for slicing through fast, agile prey rather than cracking bone. There could even be small, highly specialized cousins, no longer titans patrolling kelp forests or polar leads, each one an echo of the original, scaled to a new niche. Every move by the hunter would invite a countermove. Whale calves born into a world of Megalodon would carry in their very nerves the memory of teeth. Over millions of years, those that hear better, react faster, and keep closer to the heart of the pod would survive more often. You can imagine great baleen whales evolving sonar-like sensitivity to low-frequency disturbances, detecting the subtle pressure wake of an approaching shark long before it closes in. Sperm whales might refine their communal defences, encircling calves in living walls of scarred adults, while giant squid retreat to more erratic three-dimensional migration paths, abandoning predictable routes that once made them easy to ambush. Fast pelagic fish would respond in their own way, their schools becoming tighter, their bodies sleeker, their migrations threading through colder, riskier corridors where Megalodon's warm-adapted kin hesitate to follow. The entire mid-ocean would become a slow arms race of senses and speed, of camouflage and cooperation, written across fins and flukes instead of metal hulls. And above all of this, our own species would be changing too, not in bones and teeth, but in culture and technology. To share the modern ocean with evolving Megalodon lineages is to accept that the sea is never fully mapped, never fully tamed. We'll ask more of our instruments, filling the depths with listening arrays, neutrally buoyant drones, and satellites tuned to the faintest disturbances on the night-dark surface. We surround shipping lanes with acoustic curtains and smart routing, not only to protect cargo, but to avoid disrupting the migrations of both hunter and hunted. Over generations, laws would harden around this awareness. International agreements might declare entire pelagic corridors off limits to mining and heavy industry, not for scenic beauty, but to preserve the invisible geometry of predator and prey. Children would grow up with charts that show not just currents and depths, but the ancient paths of Megalodon clans, traced from centuries of tags and sonar shadows. Soften your shoulders and drift here for a while for a moment. In that quieter mental ocean, this traces a different relationship with the wild, one in which our greatest technologies are turned toward giving space to something that could end us in an instant, yet does not. It would reshape how we use words like wilderness and safety, about what we allow ourselves to harvest from the sea, about where we draw the line between exploration and intrusion. And somewhere beyond that horizon of years, if both we and Megalodon's descendants endure, another possibility waits. That our curiosity about them and their evolving minds might one day be answered, not with fear, but with recognition. What would it mean if the ocean's oldest hunters began to change in ways that feel strangely familiar to us? We now follow that question into even deeper water next. Let's surface for a moment, not into daylight, but into perspective. Far above the imagined wake of a living Megalodon, the real ocean rolls on, under the same moon, under the same thin veil of air, but carrying a quieter kind of darkness. In this world, the one you know, Megalodon is gone. A pattern of energy and fear and opportunity rearranges itself around the missing shape. When Megalodon vanished about 3.6 million years ago, perhaps pushed past its limits by cooling seas, shifting currents, and the loss of the warm water whales it depended on, it would reshape the lives of the communities that survived. Smaller sharks expanded into new roles, toothed whales diversified into hunters of squid and fish and each other, and the open ocean food web settled into a new balance that would ripple forward through millions of years, right up to the waves outside your window tonight. This follows an ocean that might have been, laid gently against the ocean that is. In the parallel history we are tracing, the impact of Megalodon's continued presence keeps certain whale lineages faster, more social, more watchful in the dark, while in our real seas those same lineages have faced a different apex predator. Us. Industrial whaling, longline fisheries, plastic, noise, and climate change have become the new pressures that shape their evolution and their chances. So let's ask a quiet question. If the imagined shadow of Megalodon can still move you, if the idea of a vast hunter gliding unseen beneath ships and storms stirs something in you, what does that say about the real giants that still remain? Blue whales longer than city buses, whale sharks sieving plankton by the ton, great whites tracing invisible highways between islands and continents. They are not hypothetical. They are here, fragile and resilient at the same time, their futures intertwined with our choices. Let your breath slow and step out of the day just enough to see that our oceans are now places of both absence and possibility. The crater that ended the dinosaurs, the extinctions that followed, the losses we have caused with our own hands, have narrowed the cast of characters in the sea, but they have not emptied the stage. There is still time to decide which silhouettes will haunt the dreams of minds yet to come. Will they inherit only fossils and stories, or living migrations that still crease the surface at dusk? We'll follow that decision point into the next layer of this alternate ocean, where human ships, cities, and ambitions must learn to share the water with a predator that never left. So now, before we follow those ships and cities any farther, breathe out slowly and let the day soften for a moment. Imagine the ocean at night, not as a map with shipping lanes and depth contours, but as a single dark surface breathing under the sky, and know that in this story, somewhere far below that calm skin, a hidden giant still turns in the water. This concerns a world that looks, at first glance, like our own. There are satellites tracing the curve of Earth. There are ports humming with human energy. There are headlines about storms and currents and distant coasts. Yet beneath those headlines, glowing research stations hang in the blackness, small islands of light on the continental slopes, where cameras stare out into the dark and wait for a silhouette that has not been seen in 3.5 million years. Farther offshore, listening arrays lie motionless on the seafloor, long lines of hydrophones drinking in the low sounds of the deep. They record the distant thunder of waves collapsing on unseen cliffs, the slow musical calls of migrating whales, and sometimes, in this alternate history, a moving gap in the sound. A presence that bends echoes around its enormous body as it passes. Above them, coastal towns sleep under a sky washed with sodium orange and starlight, their harbours quiet, their breakwaters reaching out into black water. Fishing boats rock, gentle symbol of the unknown, of the deep reservoirs of power and memory that still lie unexplored in the world, and within each listener, vast regions that are not meant to be conquered in a single impact of will, but approached with patience, respect, and a kind of reverence. So let the giant sink back into the dark now, not as a source of fear, but as a distant presence. Let the glowing stations dim, the listening arrays fall silent, the whales become simple, slow-moving shapes under your closed eyelids. In deep time, the imagined ocean can change from a hunting ground into a backdrop, a calm, steady cradle for your thoughts, where every wave that reaches the shore of your awareness is allowed to arrive, to break, and to fade. As your breathing settles into that same tidal rhythm, guided wind down, you can allow this alternate Earth to keep turning without you for a while. The ships will still move, the whales will still rise and fall, the hidden giant will still patrol its depths, and when we return, we follow those movements again, tracing how a single enduring predator would change everything about the ways humans build, sail, and dream on the edge of its domain. So for now, we now let that alternate Earth keep spinning without us, and let's follow something else instead, down into the quiet. Imagine the last wake of a distant ship smoothing itself back into glass, the last call of a whale fading into the low, patient hum of the planet. Far below that calm surface, the giant begins to slow. In the warm, dim waters where it has hunted for millions of years, Megalodon turns its massive head, the pale scars along its flanks catching the last grains of light. The impact of its passing has scattered fish and stirred cold rivers from below, but the chase is over now. The whales have slipped into different corridors of the sea, and the energy that powered this living engine for so many years ebbs into something gentler. With a slow beat of its tail, it angles downward, leaving the starlit skin of the ocean behind. Layer by layer, the world around it darkens. Sunlit blue gives way to violet, then to a deep, endless indigo where colours fall toward extinction, and only faint sparks of bioluminescence remain. This is about a descent measured not in minutes but in pressure and silence, as the water cools against its vast body and the sounds of the surface grow thin. Above, waves still rise and fall over coasts and cities. Below, a shape longer than a bus becomes only a suggestion, then a shadow, and then a memory in the black. Breathe out slowly and settle in for a moment. On this earth, the one under your feet, Megalodon is gone. Its teeth scattered in ancient sediments, its hunting grounds turned into rock on the seafloor. Yet in imagination it still swims beside container ships and coral reefs, sharing space with our fears and our wonder. We're always going to live with forces larger than us, whether they are real predators or changing climates, or the long, patient rhythms of evolution, and we'll ask not how to control them completely, but how to listen. In that listening there is a quiet responsibility. Every extinct giant, from the great marine reptiles to the dinosaurs that fell after the Chicxulub impact, was once as real as any living whale, as present and certain as the tide. To remember them is to remember that Earth has carried many worlds, many stories, in deep time, and that the oceans we cross tonight hold their own fragile, irreplaceable lives. Supporting their protection